Never trust a smile again. The hit horror movie Smile is now streaming on Paramount+. After witnessing a bizarre traumatic incident involving a patient, Dr. Rose Cotter starts experiencing frightening occurrences that she can't explain. As an overwhelming terror begins taking over her life, Rose must confront her troubling past in order to survive and escape her horrifying new reality. Smile is now streaming on Paramount+. Rated R, head to ParamountPlus.com to try it free. So this is the strangest thing that I've ever seen, and it was somewhere in West Virginia years ago. I was hiking through the woods off trail, and at some point I came across a really random field that was quite large, that was clearly someone's farm. I was about to go around it too until I noticed a bunch of people wearing what looked like cloth diapers and head wraps while burning a cross with a pig hanging from a chain. They were speaking in a language that I didn't recognize. They saw me. We both sort of had a deer in the headlights moment look for what felt like forever. But then a few started my way, and I have never run back up a mountain in the dark so fast for so long. I still have no clue what they were doing. I don't think that I could find that place again if I wanted to be honest. But what I can say is that West Virginia has some weird people in it. This was about 4 or 5-ish years ago, and back then, I lived with my mother in a shed on a farm surrounded by woodland. Our farmland was a part of a large piece of farmland that was split up and sold off, so we did have neighbours, though they were roughly half a kilometre away each. We loved that though because of the privacy. It wasn't like there was nobody nearby that I couldn't go to if I needed help too. And that thought is what had me fearlessly walking alone at night between the hours of 7 and 8 p.m, sometimes fluctuating from earlier to later depending on the day. Sometimes I even went out on a walk at 2 a.m. in the morning because I was restless and I just couldn't sleep. Looking back, this was incredibly stupid, I know that. And after this incident, I never walked after 6 p.m. ever again, always making sure that there was at least some sunlight left when I set out. So, the route that I always took was a road circuit. The first part was out in the open in front of all the other farms, including my own. If anything had happened, at least one person would have noticed, and reception was pretty good, so I would have also been able to call someone. The second half, on the other hand, was concealed by about 200 meters of woods between the farms and the back road, stretching the full 2 kilometers at the back of the farm, and it was during that part of the walk when I had this creepy encounter. So, it was late at night. I can't remember what time exactly, but it was pitch black, with the exception of my torchlight. I was about to approach the turn in the loop that would bring me out to the open again when I heard it. Help. It was this sort of monotone voice that repeatedly asked for help. It didn't seem panicked in the least. I took my headphones out and turned my music off to make sure that I was hearing correctly, but it didn't stop. Help. Help is what it said. A very stupid part of me almost responded too, because for some reason my first instinct was, oh no, someone's in trouble. Like a naive kid, even though I would have been like 16 or 17 at the time. Of course, then my brain kicked in and I realized that approaching that voice was just about the stupidest thing that I could do. So I started quietly backing away. Unfortunately, my cat had followed me on the walk and wasn't backing away with me. No, she was walking towards the voice, softly hissing. I remember desperately trying to get her back to come towards me without alerting the voice to my presence, just in case they hadn't noticed me yet. But I was getting scared and didn't want to stay there a moment more, so I ran towards her, grabbed her, then turned around and bolted back towards my house. I don't know if it was stupid of me to turn my back to the voice, as I was making so much noise while running that there was no way they didn't know that I was there, and I had no way of knowing if they were giving chase or anything too. I was just completely terrified that whole time. The image of someone cloaked in shadows chasing me entered my mind, and Even though I couldn't hear anyone behind me, I never once slowed down until I was back safe and sound within my house. But it doesn't end there, though. You see, despite how terrifying it was, there was still a part of me that was concerned about whoever it was, because what if they really did need help? So I asked my mother to drive us to the location, another very stupid decision considering what we found, that being nothing. We called out and called out, but nobody ever answered. We didn't get out of our car, obviously. Luckily, neither of us were that stupid, I guess you could say, but we drove home having seen nothing and no one. But it still bothered me in the morning, so I had my mother drive us over again, and we searched the immediate area. Nothing, though. No indication that anyone had even been there. There was no body, which admittedly was a drastic thing to search for, I know, but I know shock can leave you eerily calm, which could have explained the monotone voice and the lack of response afterwards, which made me fear that we'd been too late and that we'd find a body in the morning or something. I don't know if I would have preferred this outcome, to be honest, because at least then I would have had a face to the voice. But no, we found absolutely nothing, not even tracks. And to this day, I have no idea who that voice belonged to and why they were monotonously calling out for help. My mind has naturally come to some, I guess you could say, chilling conclusions and theories that leave me unable to sleep, like maybe it was a rapist, a kidnapper, a serial killer or something. All the classic horror stories, but I guess I'll just never really know for sure. So I know that we've all had, like, bad dates, right? But this is the only date that I've had to date that rang every alarm bell and waved every red flag. I'll preface this by saying that I don't really go on many dates, but when I do, I make sure that I follow safety protocol by only meeting my date in public areas, let either my family or friends know where I'm going, and park in a populated place close by to wherever we meet. Anyway, this date initially suggested that we meet at his house to watch a movie and have a few drinks, and I said no, I don't feel comfortable with that, and I only want to meet in public. He seemed okay with this, but then brought it up a few more times, and I said if money is an issue that we could meet up another time or forget about it altogether. But my date backtracked and went with my idea of meeting at a cafe that I chose, that I was familiar with and equidistant to where we both lived. So he turns up in a two-door car. This detail is relevant too, and goes into the cafe. I follow behind and introduce myself, and after a polite introduction, things begin to get, well, weird. You see, I order a Coke and he says, "Don't you want a drink?" I was going to pop into the bar, which is connected to the cafe, and get one. I say no, I'm not drinking, and he looks at me with a sort of WTF look, as if I'm being unreasonable. I already explained in messages that I don't drink as I'm on medication, so having to re-explain it again got to me a bit. He seems disappointed and goes to order a cider from the bar while I get a table. Anyway, we sat down with our drinks, and my date immediately goes on about going back to his place again, even though the original plan was to stay here and order food, and I already stated that that wasn't happening. He says something along the lines of having a few drinks and eating at his place, and I said that we don't have to eat, we can just have our drinks and leave. He gets defensive and says that he has money but prefers it if we go back to his. I make a joke and say, "You're not a killer, are you?" And instead of laughing it off, he stares at me sort of uncannily and says, "You don't think that I would hurt you, do you?" I laugh uncomfortably and say of course not, but really I'm relieved that this date won't be going any further. The date suddenly says, "Are you going to follow me in your car? Because that wouldn't make sense. How about we go in my car, but I've got packages in the front, so you'll have to squeeze in the back, and I'll drop you back off at your car after." In reality, that made less sense. The fact that it was completely illogical too made it even more creepy in my mind. Every alarm bell was going off at this point, and I said, "Look, I don't want to go to yours, and your insistence is giving me the creeps." The date looks shocked, mumbles something about needing the toilet, and excuses himself from the table. A few moments later, I see him through the cafe window getting into his car and driving off. Obviously, it was a massive bullet dodge in my opinion. But as I was watching him leave, also the fact that his car didn't actually have back doors made it seem even more sinister, because imagine if something did happen in the car and then you just couldn't get out. I mean, being in those back seats, there was no way out but past him. So before I begin this, I just want to say that I'm looking for some answers to what happened to me when I was around 12 to 13 years old. I'm 23 now, but these events, they still loom over me. So at the time, I was living in Virginia with my parents and 2 step-siblings. We had recently moved into a newly built townhouse development. Our townhouse had 3 floors in total. The upstairs area is where the bedrooms were located. The living room and the kitchen were on the main floor, and the basement was my sister's bedroom. At the time, I was becoming increasingly interested in the paranormal too. I would watch all sorts of ghost shows on television, and eventually I learned what a Ouija board was. I wanted one too, but I knew that I wouldn't have the means to buy a real one myself, and I knew my parents would not approve too, so I opted to make my own. I created a template on a piece of cardboard, carefully replicating what a real one would look like. For the planchette, I used a plastic square-shaped lid that was the perfect size. I heard that it wasn't safe to use it by myself, and I didn't have any friends in the area at the time, so I asked my sister if she would try it with me. She was reluctant at first, but after some convincing, she was game. Her uncle had recently passed a few months prior, so we decided to try and contact him. We set the board up in the basement, her bedroom, with a picture of her uncle next to us. We both lightly put our fingers on the makeshift planchette, and I began to ask questions like, "Uncle so-and-so, are you here with us tonight?" To both of our surprise, too, it didn't take long to get a response. The planchette moved to yes with force. At first, I assumed that my sister was messing with me, but soon I would be proved wrong because she started crying very hard. After a few more questions with responses, my sister informed me that she wanted to stop. I don't really remember what else we asked because it was so long ago, but I do remember that the planchette would move with haste after every question that we asked, and we ended up informing her uncle that we were leaving and moving the piece to goodbye. Afterwards, it took some time for my sister to calm down, and I was pretty blown away myself, I'll admit. But then, strange things started happening to me almost immediately after. After we had finished using the board, we both went upstairs to calm down and watch some TV, and 30 minutes later, I heard a bang come from the basement. I went downstairs to investigate and found that the planchette had moved from goodbye to no, and a picture on the wall had fallen down. This disturbed me a bit, so afterwards I opted to tear up the board and throw it away. After I did this, I assumed that that was the end of it, and for my sister it was. I didn't know that this was the beginning of months of pure terror for me. I don't know why, but whatever this thing was attached to me. My sister didn't have any odd occurrences afterwards, but meanwhile, I started noticing strange things happening. It started sort of small at first. I noticed our family dog would all of a sudden refuse to come into my bedroom. I would pick him up and take him into my room anyways, and when he was in there, he would act really strange. His ears would stick straight up, and his eyes would fixate on a certain corner in the room. He would whine and bark, and occasionally his head would dart around like he was watching something move around. Then, I was sitting in my room another day on my own. I was watching TV and laughing at the show that I was watching. My school blinders were sort of sitting all the way at the foot of my bed, and I was sitting at the head of the bed a good distance away, when one of the blinders slid all the way across my bed, hitting me in the arm. This freaked me out, and I informed my parents, but they told me that I was just imagining things. And weird things like this kept happening to me. At one time, I walked into the kitchen during the day by myself, and a sponge that was sitting on the dining room table suddenly flew across the room with force. I continued to experience things like this, and they started becoming more frequent, I guess you could say. I talked to my sister about it, and she told me that nothing odd was happening for her. I was just a complete mess at the time, though. I did not want to go home and would often try and go to a friend's house after school instead, which most of the time didn't work out. I talked to my parents again, and go figure, they thought that I was making it up for attention again. After a little bit of going through it, though, I had the most terrifying night of my life, and this event still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. It traumatized me, and although I've worked past it for the most part, I still try not to think about it. I've only told a few people in my life about this too, because it sounds like a straight-up lie, and I know it. But this night was the climax of my experiences, and after this happened, the activity just completely stopped. So one night, I was lying in my bed. It was 2 or 3 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep, so I was just sort of laying there. My whole family was asleep, and the house was completely dark. I slept with my door open at the time, and the only light source was a blue light emanating from my radio in my room. It was just bright enough to illuminate my room, and I had my blanket over my head, covering half my face, but I could still see my room from waist height down to the floor. And to my horror, as I laid there with my eyes open, a black figure entered my field of vision near the foot of my bed. It was right next to my bed too, and there was no color on whatever this was. It was a pure pitch black with no obvious features. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. I just laid there as I watched this thing slowly move down my bed until it stopped right in front of my face. I then felt a hand placed on my head through the blanket that was over me. The hand rested there for a second, and then began moving in a circular motion for a few seconds. Eventually the hand lifted, and I watched the dark figure slowly move away, and then out of the room. This was the last thing that ever happened to me. After that, like I said, it just completely stopped as fast as it started. This whole ordeal has had a huge impact on my life. This is the first time that I'm sharing this story like this with a lot of people. I haven't tried until now because I didn't want to type it out and relive it, I guess. And now I'm more curious as to what the heck happened to me and what that thing was. I think I should probably also add that, aside from anxiety and depression issues, I am mentally sound. I've never experienced hallucinations or delusions, not that I know of anyway, and I know that what happened to me was real. I'm sharing this not only to share my story, but to also gain insight from others. So, what do you think this could have been? Was it a demon, as I've heard? Has anyone hearing this had any similar experiences? I wish that I could be more detailed, but it's been so long and I've largely tried to forget about this time of my life that it's really hard to remember everything. But if you can help me out, then thanks in advance. Four years ago, I was a sophomore in high school. I hadn't yet got my license, and this is right around the time that I started to partake. Me and one of my friends in the neighborhood, Kurt, knew of a creek about 1.5 miles from my house, which would be a nice place to smoke, but it was a bit of a hike to get there. It was well known that there was a few scattered structures in the woods there too, such as a concrete hut, an old barrel fire pit, and a platform built into the trees, all within a few dozen feet of each other. This is all about 1/4 mile into the woods and about 1/2 mile from any roads. We had been there during the daytime dozens of times before, usually with more friends. But we lived in a nice suburban neighborhood, so it didn't seem dangerous to us. Not to mention, nobody else had ever been spotted there before. In fact, it had become a pretty common smoking spot for kids our age. We all just assumed that it was an old abandoned homeless structure, but there were still legends passed around by other high schoolers making claims of something sinister there. Hooks for hands, serial murders, inbred cannibals, typical campfire stories, I guess you could say, that type of thing. Anyway, the concrete hut itself was about 7 by 7 by 5 foot, and the ground had been dug out on the inside, making the roof even taller. We had found improvised weapons, food, cans, trash there, This was all when we first discovered it 2 years earlier, but nothing of that nature since then. Just beer cans, roaches, and cigarette butts scattered around the fire pit from neighborhood kids. The inside was scribbled with Sharpie, the top was covered with a tarp, and the whole thing smelled terrible, so none of us dared to enter it. Like I mentioned before, there was also a lookout platform built into a tree about 50 feet away. An improvised ladder made of branches led to the 5x5 platform about 20 feet off the ground. The wood was clearly water damaged, so I had never wanted to actually go up there. Back on track though, this particular October evening, Kurt and I left at about 6 p.m, hoping to get there before dark. We had several other smoke spots that were closer to my house, but nothing quite matched the excitement and mystique of the hut. So we make our way through the neighborhood, through some backyards, into a field, and we finally pass through the tree line. Stones laid out across the creek allowed us to cross without getting wet. But right around the time we got there too, the sun was almost fully set, and no light was coming through the trees. This was the first time either of us had been there at night. We hiked the last 500 feet uphill, and we could just barely see the hut through the darkness. The atmosphere, though, had us both uneasy that day, and we talked with the quietest whisper possible. We didn't want to approach the structure, so we decided to smoke about 50 feet from the hut, right on the edge of the bluff that we just climbed. I decided to shift a few feet over to more even footing before we started, and I felt my foot snag on a fishing line running about a foot off the ground, tied to the tree next to me. A loud clang was made as the line yanked an empty metal bucket into a metal scrap planted on the ground, almost like a makeshift alarm. We hear someone moving down from the platform in the tree about 20 feet away from us and drop into the leaves below. We take off down the bluff, sliding on our butts and hitting trees, and we still hear scurrying and grunting behind us. We get to the bottom and sprint through the creek. I trip on a loose rock below me and fall into the freezing cold water before bolting up and continuing to run. About a second later, we hear splashes behind us. At this point, we clear the tree line and are in a quarter mile of open field. We sprint as fast as we can away. Kurt and I are hurt, out of breath, and the person is clearly catching up. We can hear them right behind us breathing heavily, and their loud footsteps growing closer and closer. We sprint through someone's backyard and we hear their dog start barking. We finally run into the middle of the street and a car slams on their brakes. Kurt and I screech to a halt to avoid this car. We turn around to see somebody standing just outside of the floodlights of a nearby house. Before they turn around and run away back towards the forest. We apologized to the driver, ditched the weed, and I called my sister to come and pick us up. We explained to her what happened, begged her not to tell my parents, and after that, we never returned to that creek ever again. This story occurred a few years back now, while I was staying at my grandparents' house during vacation. They lived near the Atlantic Wall, the system of concrete blockhouses built by Nazi Germany during World War II. At the time, I was 16 and fascinated with urbex, so I thought that it would be a great idea to go and explore those. When I arrived on the beach, I started exploring and everything went well, since this place is actually public and a lot of people come here like you would do any normal beach, I guess. Time passed by and there was nothing really interesting to see, so I made the decision to go deep into the dunes to find other structures. I found some, but they were all sort of buried in the sand or covered with vegetation, until I found this one. I was super excited, and when I arrived, I started to barge in just like I did before. But suddenly, a gut feeling stopped me at one of the entrances. I kept quiet and listened. There was this sort of, like indistinct chatter or moaning. Honestly, I don't know what kept me around after that, but for some stupid reason I chose the option of yelling, "Hello, is anyone there?" multiple times. The sounds coming from inside stopped, and the atmosphere was getting quite tense, so I made my way to the roof. It was a single ramp, no exit. Stupid decision again, but curiosity was too strong. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man comes out and started the weirdest discussion with me. He asked me if I was alone and what my age was. I was obviously a minor, then proceeded to tell me that what they were doing inside was perfectly right and I shouldn't call the police, without waiting for my answers. At the end of his little speech, he asked me if I wanted to go inside. Obviously, I refused. Thank God he didn't insist and went back in. As I went away, I passed by one of the other entrances that happened to provide a direct view of the inside. I took a peek and instantly ran the heck out of there. What I briefly saw was another old man, naked, playing with himself, looking at me. In the background, I saw many other figures and candles on the ground. I heard some sort of chanting too. After I put enough distance, I took my phone out and called the police. What I told them was just too surreal for them to believe me, and I was basically laughed at and given a lecture about prank calls. And no one believes me other than my dad. He had weird encounters in those dunes as well. I don't know what kind of stuff in a bunker trying to lure miners in that was, but after that, I quit Urbex. Also, I never thought of it, but I actually just found an article online related to this. Basically, the beach that I went to is right next to a nudist beach. I must have crossed the border by going into the dunes without realizing it, but over the past 40 years, the beach was about to be closed multiple times since libertines see an opportunity to go there and have sex. Many of them cause disruption since it's completely illegal to do that. Plus, the dunes are a protected environment, so it's actually forbidden to go there. And after I just had a chat with my grandma, she says that police went there many times already to make them leave, but it doesn't stop them from going back. Ironically, too, the article mentioned the raising concerns about the situation lasting exactly from the same period this happened to me. And well, those guys that I met are very extreme libertines, apparently, and some suggested that I go back there with friends to collect evidence, but I have to wait till next summer, plus confronting these people really doesn't seem like a good idea to me. Also, just to be clear, the article is not about a sex cult or anything wicked like that. It simply mentions the conflict between naturists and libertines who come on this beach to get it on and whatnot, and how the authorities want to close the beach regarding that, and that was pretty much it. It was a coincidence supporting my story, but not about my story, if you get my drift. Anyway, like I said, after this, I quit Urbex, and maybe I'll go back at some point and have a look around, but I won't be doing it alone this time. That's for sure. A few years back, I was living with my aunt and uncle after moving to a new state. They had just moved into a new home in a new subdevelopment. In this area, door-to-door salesmen swarm new developments and new buildings for water softeners, cleaning supplies, solar panels, generators, and the Kirby vacuum people. They wandered the neighborhood all day knocking on doors, but were usually gone by around 5 p.m. This particular evening, I was home alone with my dog, a mutt who was mostly black lab and an unknown mixture. He was roughly the size and weight of a full-breed Labrador, but he had a sort of stockier build and long wiry hair. He was a gentle, sweet baby who was upset if someone spoke harshly to him. I'd never known him to be threatening to anyone. My aunt and uncle were out celebrating their anniversary. This time of year, the days were getting longer, and we would have full dark by around 8 p.m. It was around 7 p.m. and starting to get dusky when someone rang the doorbell and knocked on the door. The door was one with those sort of thick glass over windows, and I could see the door and who was there from the kitchen. I was going to ignore them, but unfortunately they could see me and continued to knock, so I went to answer the door. The dog followed me, but stood off to the side in the shadows of the dining room. The person at the door was a young man, about college age, dressed in a collared shirt and tie and khakis. I looked a bit like a Mormon missionary with style, I guess you could say. He was thin and about my height, 5'8", 5'9". I figured he was a salesman of some sort, but thought that it was a bit odd that he was out this late in the day. I thought that I'd open the door a crack, tell him that I'm not interested, and then just lock the door. So I opened the door a few inches to speak through it, and he starts his spiel about Kirby vacuum cleaners and he wants to come in and give a demo and all that. But one, It's not my house, and two, I know once they get in that they aren't leaving without selling something, and I have no need for an overpriced vacuum, and I don't have $1,000+ to spend anyway. So I tell him no thank you, I'm not interested, and begin to close the door when he puts his foot between the door and the door jamb and throws his hands up to stop the door from closing. This is when I think, what the heck? And I hear a vicious growling behind me to my right, and then a loud deep barking as my dog lunges for the door. I grab his collar to keep him from going out the door, and the guy's mouth drops open. His eyes get really wide, and he looks like he's ready to pass out or pee himself as he jumps back from the door and backs away saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, wrong house, and then turns and runs to the end of the driveway where a car with 3 men in it pulls up to get him, allegedly, and they speed off, tires squealing. I told my aunt and uncle about it when they got home, and we told a few neighbours so that they could keep an eye out for unusual behaviour. It's possible that they were a team of Kirby salesmen, I suppose. They do travel in teams of 4 sometimes and follow the door knockers in the car with the vacuum, but I was suspicious because it was late in the day for them to be knocking on doors, and it was a team of 4 men. Usually they have a team with 2 or more women in the group because they're knocking on doors at a time of day when women are going to be home alone and unlikely to let strange men in. So, I still don't know if it was a team of Kirby salesmen or not, but something tells me that it wasn't. And I'm sure glad that my dog was there with me that day to save my butt. So one summer, I was traveling in East Africa. I was fairly young and hadn't even finished high school, but I was with a small group of people who were about my age. Our group had 2 trip leaders who stayed with us the whole time, in addition to local guides who accompanied us for different legs of the trip. During the trip, we went to Serengeti National Park to spend a few days going on safaris. Following our first day of safaris, it was time to go to site where we would be sleeping. When we arrived at the site, which was in the middle of the national park in the evening, and I was quite surprised to see that the only things there were basic camping tents and an outhouse. I'd been on safaris before, but we stayed in actual buildings, so this was a bit unexpected. Anyway, night finally comes and it's time for everyone to go to bed. Our group was split up by gender. The girls were in one tent and guys in another, with trip leaders and local guides in their own. There was only one other guy my age on the trip, so it was just me and him sharing a tent to ourselves. The outhouse was away from the tents, about 50 meters or so. It smelled horrible, so nobody wanted to sleep next to it. Our local guides instructed us to always go to the outhouse in pairs because of the dangerous wildlife in the park, which we were camping right in the middle of. I assumed that this was a standard precautionary warning that they'd issued as a just in case. But about halfway through the night, I suddenly was desperate to take a pee. I didn't want to wake up the other guy in my tent to go to the outhouse, so I decided to just pee right behind our tent by myself. So I grabbed my headlamp, put on my shoes, and I head outside. As I'm peeing, I hear something on the ground nearby crack, though. It couldn't have been more than 10 meters away, and I instantly turned my head to shine my dull headlamp in that direction, which illuminates 2 pairs of eyes that are intensely staring right back at me. If you don't know, animal eyes have a reflection when you shine a light on them at night, and I was completely paralyzed by how close these creatures were to me, how still they were being. We stared at each other for 10 to 15 seconds before I decided to hurry back into the tent and tried to fall back to sleep. The next morning, as our whole group is eating breakfast, the girls start talking about how something brushed up against their tent in the night and scared them half to death. I tell them about the 2 pairs of eyes that were staring at me and how it scared me too, when one of our local guides chimes in to say that it was just hyenas and that there's nothing to be afraid of since they're scared of humans. This calms the group down a bit. I deer hunt a bit though, so I knew that different animals reflect different colors when you shine a light at their eyes. So I asked the guide what color hyena eyes reflect, and he said blue. I told him that the eyes that I saw were gold and asked what animal reflects that color. He seems a bit shocked by that, but replies that the only animal that could have been was apparently lions. When my daughter was 2, I was having a really tough time as a single mother, and so I decided to take a road trip up Highway 1. I made reservations in Trinidad at a cool cabin in the woods, within walking distance of the beach. Before I left, my stepfather gave me a loaded .38 revolver, which I stored under the driver's seat. Sometime after driving through San Francisco, it was very late and dark and nobody was on the highway. My daughter was sleeping peacefully in her car seat next to me. Back then, we could legally have car seats in the front. I noticed a car, though, coming up behind me and passed but then sort of slowed down, driving alongside of me. I sped up and slowed down, but I just couldn't shake him. I looked over and this guy had his interior light on and was furiously gesturing for me to pull over. I knew that I had to find a safe place. There was nobody else on the road and I was running low on gas. There was just nothing on the highway for miles, but I kept driving and this guy just wouldn't leave me alone. I was getting pretty frightened, but the mama bear was coming out and I was getting very angry as well. I knew that he could see my kid who was still sleeping. Finally, there was an exit up ahead and a gas station in the middle of nowhere, so I took the exit with the guy closely following me. I really wasn't sure what to do. I mean, the gas station was brightly lit, but it had no customers. I didn't feel that it was safe to pull in, so I slowly passed it, drove further into the dark, deserted landscape, and pulled into a large dirt area and drove quite a ways off the highway with him following. There was absolutely nothing around, and I knew that I was in big trouble, and I needed to take control and wanted to put him in a vulnerable situation. Mama Bear was in full protective mode now. So I stopped the car, I grabbed the gun and I jumped out, locking the car behind me. As he pulled up, I ran around to the passenger side and waited. He then got out of his car and quickly moved towards me, and I suddenly held the gun up, visible in the moonlight. He came to a halt, surprised, and then I leveled the gun across the car, taking aim, and waited. He stood there, seemingly weighing his options, and then just turned around, got back in his car, and he left. I think the eeriest thing about this whole thing, though, is that not a single word was spoken the whole time. The whole thing, it totally freaked me out. This occurred around 1999 and 2000. So my best friend and I were avid outdoor adventurers and also amateur pot growers. We would frequently find secluded places in the woods that allowed for ample light and shade for plants to grow and that would not allow them to be easily found. One particular day, we went to an annex of trails located near a New Jersey State Park trail system. The trails weren't actually in the park, but I had hiked them before and knew that they weren't, frequented that much. We had gone out that day with our seeds, partially sprouted in moist paper towels. We parked the car at the trailhead and we started hiking in. We covered a mile or so and then ventured off the trail and into the woods. We found a clearing, planted the seeds, and tied a few barely visible ribbons off to mark the way to the plant spot to check them in the future. My friend and I got back on the trail and we started walking back to the car, when my friend noticed a man in the other direction just sort of staring at us. He was probably in his 30s or 40s, bald head, normal clothes. We didn't think anything of it for the most part, but we definitely kept looking back as anyone would when someone is behind them in the woods, right? Well, we saw that he was walking 60 plus or so feet behind us. It seemed weird, but it was probably more so due to us having anxiety that we just planted seeds. We picked up the pace, but the man also seemed to pick up the pace as we weren't gaining any distance. At one point, we decided to just get off the trail and let him pass. We turned off the trail and walked into a thicket of sticks and bushes, which I remember vividly getting shredded on. We got deeper into the woods and then we heard cursing. When we turned around, the man was coming through where we entered. It was at that moment that we actually became scared. Mind you, we were two strong 19-year-olds, but a man following you in the woods is pretty darn creepy. We made a kind of U maneuver to sort of outflank him and came out of the woods a bit further down the trail, and once on the trail, well, we ran. As we were running, there was a fork in the trail and my friend went right and I went left. I realized my mistake as my buddy was going down the correct path and I wasn't. So I turned around and started running back towards the fork to follow my friend. As I was running towards the direction that we came from to get to the fork, I could see the man running towards me down the trail. He was a distance away, but not far enough in my eyes. Survival mode kicked in and I ran as hard as I could. I caught up to my friend who was sort of walking at that point. I screamed, "He's after us," and we both booked it all the way to the car. We got in the car, shaking and out of breath. We backed up and started to get out of the parking lot when the man appeared at the trailhead. He stopped there and just sort of stared at us as we finally drove away. Now, I always wonder what all of that was about. Did he want to kill a couple of 19-year-olds there and then? Was he also doing something illegal in those woods and wanted us gone? My buddy and I still laugh and talk about that day 22 years ago, and we also wonder if those seeds ever took root. This one time when I was like 15, I was staying the night at a friend's house and I had this really weird experience. The area is very wooded around the house and there's a good distance between each neighboring house. Well, we were all in the basement. I was laying on a futon watching my friends play a game and at some point I wound up falling asleep at around 10 PM I believe. But I woke up not even an hour after that to one of my friends frantically trying to wake me up to go upstairs. I asked why, and he told me that someone was outside the house. I rush upstairs to see the friend that lived there with a pistol pointed at the front door. He told me that he was sitting at the dining table when he saw someone peer into the glass part of his front door. He had me stay with his niece on the other side of the house while we waited for his older brother to get home. I was really freaked out, but after his brother had gotten home, it turns out that he had all the security cameras all around the house, and when they checked it, they watched the footage when there was nothing there. Not a single sign of someone approaching the home at all. To this day, I still wonder if he was just seeing something, or if it was something else entirely that he had actually seen. Weirdly, I've had a lot of situations like this happen with this particular friend, and they've always happened when I was asleep, which obviously is very strange. I'll begin this story with a quick note about the home that I grew up in. The home was an old mill home that was moved from one location to where it stands now, and a basement was dug during the construction by my family. The home looks like your normal home, I guess, unless you really look at it, because there's a window above the garage that always seems to give a sort of eerie feeling, like someone was watching me through there. Now, I've never seen anyone standing there, obviously. For some reason, you just cannot rid yourself of that uneasy feeling. Growing up, I had multiple paranormal occurrences. My father raised me and my sister in that home, so she and I had spent plenty of time alone. When I was a younger child, I never slept without a light, TV, or radio on. I needed noises, light, or something to distract me from feeling uneasy and watched. I don't know any other history of my home except that it was moved. I feel like whatever is in that house is unhappy about that fact too. The house almost feels, I don't know, like cursed in a way. I don't have the same nostalgic sense that people get from seeing or visiting their childhood home. Even today when I visit, I feel uncomfortable still. Anyway, one day I was left alone in my preteen years. I was a fairly responsible kid and I was just playing on the computer while my father was out running some errands. I heard a voice coming through the speakers, which was impossible as the computer was not hooked to the internet, nor was I playing a game that had voices, as I was playing solitaire on Windows. Next, I heard heavy, loud footsteps coming from the hallway towards the room that I was in. They sounded a lot like the cowboy boots that my dad always wore. So I said, "Hello, Dad," but there was no answer. I wasn't freaked out until I peeked out of the room and I didn't see anyone. At that, I ran outside and the truck wasn't there either. I instantly picked up the house phone to call my dad and went hitting the green call button. The phone made a sort of loud screeching sound. I dropped the phone where I stood without hanging up and I ran outside until my dad showed up about 30 minutes later. Of course, I tried to tell him what happened and he replied, "Oh, you probably just picked up a semi-driver's radio on the computer and you're just hearing things." I couldn't believe that he thought that I was making it up, to be honest. So, over the years, I didn't have many problems with the home, until I was alone again in my bedroom, studying on my bed, my cat Spock sitting with me on my book. After an hour or so, he suddenly just got up and fluffed up, first standing on edge, staring towards my open closet. He hissed and spat at what seemed like nothing, but then the room got really cold, and I, of course, got up to see what he could have been so frightened of. Nothing was there, nor did I hear anything. That was until I heard whispering outside of my bedroom door. I quickly swung it open, but again, there was nothing. In the end, I wrote it off as the heater making noise, and I went to bed, or tried to at least. I laid down, lamp still on, when all of a sudden my radio turned itself on. This was an old radio without a remote, so there was no way that it could just turn on without hitting the button. And because of that, I didn't sleep that night. My story picks back up again when I was 18. I lived alone in the house as my father had picked up a job in another state. I had a friend over for the night, and after our movie marathon, we tried to go to bed. As we sat there in the quiet dark, he said, "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked. "Those voices. There are people talking." "What?" He shushed me, and as we sat there in the darkness, you could hear two people whispering to each other outside of my bedroom. I got up to investigate, and there was nobody there. "Screw this," he said. I picked up my cell phone to call my dad, and instead of the phone ringing, I got a sort of message saying that the number wasn't in service. That was impossible, I said. So we ran outside, and I drove to a church parking lot. I dialed my dad again, and it went through, but he didn't answer. I called my best friend to ask if we could sleep at her house for the night, and she agreed. That friend spent many nights at my house as a child, and she also felt the unease in my home, and she understood. My last paranormal experience, though, that happened when I moved back into my parents' home after a failed relationship many years later in 2017. I was taking a nap on the couch while my dad was out, and I was woken up by someone whispering in my ear, "Hey." I swung up off the couch, looked around, confused, and I grabbed my cell phone. When I tried to call my dad, it did the exact same screeching sound that the home phone did all those years ago. Again, I just sat outside crying, waiting on him to get home. He still didn't believe what I had experienced, and to this day, he still writes it all off. So I just got back from a family vacation in Mexico. We stayed at a nice western resort, and usually around 9:30 p.m. my family would head back to their rooms to go to sleep. Naturally, as a 25-year-old, I wanted to stay up and party or go drinking at bars, but my older brother was working remotely and wouldn't go out with me. After the family went to bed, I went out to a bar around the corner from my hotel and ended up befriending the locals there, and a 29-year-old guy from San Diego named Luke, who was there for a wedding. We got together and we sort of had a bit of fun. We started hanging out every night, in fact, after my family went to sleep, and on the third night of the trip, Luke asked if I wanted to meet him downtown with his friends. I really wanted to, but I was at an important dinner with the family that went on later than usual. I ended up staying home that night, but the next night I met him at this huge Pablo Escobar-esque mansion they rented on Airbnb, and he told me that it was good that I couldn't make it out the night before because of how scary of an experience it was. He went on to explain to me that the night before, his buddy was taking a pee outside and someone approached him and held out a key with a bump of coke on it. Without thinking, he snorted the bump, and the person who offered it was now demanding that he buy an $80 bag from them. He was drunk and refused while getting pretty aggressive towards them. Things went from bad to worse as the Mexican who offered the bump started following their group from bar to bar for the next 3 hours, taking pictures of them. He called his friends, and there were now a group of them following behind, claiming to be affiliated with the cartel. They warned that if Luke's buddy didn't pay them, they were going to call their boss. Luke eventually went over and tried to smooth things over. They told him that his friends had stolen from them and that it was going to cost him his life if someone didn't pay up. The cartel member also pulled his shirt up, revealing a 9mm pistol at his waistband. Luke did the right thing and remained calm while offering to take them to an ATM and pay out the pocket $160 US so they could be left alone. The cartel members gave him an empty coke bag and abruptly left. Even after him doing all this for his friend's safety, his friend denied any responsibility or wrongdoing, and even had the audacity to blame Luke for trying to help by getting involved. He also didn't offer Luke a single dollar. After this event happened, Luke got robbed again too in the same night with a girl who ripped his $200 gold necklace right off of his neck. And his friend was cool to me, but sounded like a real jerk, I guess, after Luke explained this to me. The poor dude was just trying to be a good friend and was met with no gratitude, only to be robbed again that night. Needless to say, I'm pretty happy that I didn't make it out to meet them that night. I also think things could have gotten a lot worse for them had he not offered the cartel members money. Be careful out there, guys, and obviously never accept free drugs from a stranger on the street in Mexico, or really anywhere, because it always comes with a price. For 12 years, I've worked as an actor for a local haunted house attraction. It's a lot of fun as I get to play a variety of horror characters and act out different scenes. And while the tours that we put on are clearly fake, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that, well, just isn't. I should start off by explaining that the building that we do this out of is extremely old and was once an elementary school. We gutted the section of the building that was classrooms and we constructed it to what we needed. And this is when we actually started having weird experiences. Now, there's plenty of activity that can be just shrugged off, such as feeling watched and hearing footsteps running in areas where no one is. But then there are things that are just not so easy to disregard. Such as one evening, a member was working on hooking up our sound system by himself. He had not even hooked up the large speakers yet, when he stated that a large deep growl came booming through them. This terrified him so much that he ran out of the building and just wouldn't go back in, even to look up until another member came down to go in with him. He never worked alone in the building again after that too. It just really shook him to the core. Other activity seems playful and childlike, I guess, such as hearing small giggles and whispering in the halls and in the rooms that are empty, things being moved from where we last placed them. But one year, I was in a rocking chair that I would jump out of as a group came through. The thing about the rocking chair is it was more like a glider and it was sort of broken, and I would have to use a lot of force to get the chair to rock backwards at all. It was right before showtime. I was sitting in this broken chair getting mentally pumped up for the night ahead. I was completely alone when I swear that I felt someone grab onto the back of the chair and harshly pull it backwards. I felt myself flying backwards with the chair, and I honestly thought that I would flip out of it. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and as soon as I stabled myself, I jerked to see who had done this. But the room that I was in was large, and no one could get out of this room without me seeing them running away in the split second that it took me to look behind me, and there was absolutely no one there, and I was suddenly covered in goosebumps. No one was even in the area around my room at the time. Later that same night too, the lights were off, my stove was on, and a group had just left my room when I noticed a small figure in the far right corner of the room. It looked like a small child crouching down looking my way, and I was immediately worried that a child had been left behind from the previous group. As I headed towards the figure to ask if they were okay, the strobe flashed and the figure that I saw was just gone. This same year but different night, I was again sitting in my chair waiting for the next group when someone or something growled right into my ear. It was so loud that it caused my ear to ring, and when I turned to see who was there that could have done this, again, there was nothing but an empty room. I changed rooms the next year and did not experience as much creepy stuff, that's for sure. There's not much history that I've been able to find out about the building too, but I'm really curious as to what could be causing all this weirdness. This is only a tiny bit of what has been experienced over the years too working there, and I don't feel that it'll be stopping anytime soon, so who knows, maybe I'll be back at some stage to tell you guys more. So every morning I wake up at 2 a.m. to let my dog out, and then we get back to sleep together on the recliner. I have neighbors, but they aren't squished right up against my house or anything. There's a sort of field behind my house too, and behind that field there's a few miles of dense woods. So I take my dog out towards the field because he doesn't like doing his business right up against the house. This morning, I hop up and take him out like normal. Leash goes on and I grab my jacket. We walk out towards the field and he starts sniffing around and doing his thing. When out of nowhere I hear a clear male voice say, "Hi there." I played it off as 2 a.m. groggy brain, but my dog heard it too. His hair shot up all down his back and his tail was tucked. He started looking around and growling. I was instantly freaked out and we hurried back inside. Mind you, I had a flashlight and I saw no one there. There couldn't have been really anyone near me too. It's 2 a.m. and my backyard is fairly large, but there's really nowhere else to go. The field is large too and the grass is about a foot tall, I guess, but the voice sounded like it came from only a few feet away. I still can't wrap my head around it, but I went out at 2 again and didn't hear anything this time. I was on edge the entire time and my poor dog was too. The spot where I take him is right at the edge of my property and the large field, so there's no way anyone was hiding near me or anything. The woods start about 40 yards away from the edge of the field. The only thing near me during this experience was a single tree on my property and the field with 1 foot tall grass. My tree is about maybe 18 foot tall and too skinny for a human to climb up. But I even flashed my light on it after my dog started growling because possums like to sit in it. I have another dog who doesn't like getting up at 2 a.m, so her fat tail will just wait until 6 to go out. Strangely enough, she won't go near the edge of the field anymore too. That's where she did her business, and even in broad daylight she won't go there anymore. Also, I'm going to start recording my dog's nightly bathroom trips because I'd honestly prefer this to never happen again, but if it does, then I want to catch something. And it would put me at ease knowing that I have proof of the event, I guess. I still don't know how to feel about it. I've never really paid attention to anything paranormal. I've only ever had another experience, but it's pretty mundane to be honest. To me, the smaller and rarer the event, I guess the more terrifying it feels, though, when the realization sets in that something actually did happen. And that night, I can say for sure that something weird definitely took place. My boyfriend, male 20, and I, a female 21, live alone and we both work weird hours. He leaves for work at around 10:30 p.m. and I leave at around 4 a.m. It's starting to get cold outside and I drive a 30-year-old Honda, so it takes a while to warm up. Now one morning I went outside at around 3:45 a.m. to start my car so that it would be warmed up by the time that I was leaving for work. When I went outside to start my car too, there was nobody else outside and no other cars that I could see besides the ones parked in my neighbor's driveways. There was not a car parked in front of my house at all, and then at 4 a.m. it was time for me to leave. I got all my stuff ready and was walking to my car, and as I'm walking I hear a man yell, "Hey." I ignored it because obviously it's 4 in the morning and dark outside and I'm a female, but I noticed his car was parked directly in front of my house, which is honestly weird to me by itself. So then again he yelled, "Hey," but was a bit louder this time. I still refused to even look in that direction, and I pretended that I didn't hear him. He yelled over and over again, "Hey, can I get a jump?" asking me to jump his car. He kept getting louder each time and seemed like he was starting to get frustrated, I guess. At this point, all I was thinking was this guy was not out here 15 minutes ago. How did he suddenly pull up and his car died conveniently right in front of my house, all within 15 minutes? So anyway, I continued to pretend like I didn't hear him, got in my car and immediately locked the doors and left. As I was driving away, I kept my eyes on the mirrors, and when I got about maybe a block and a half away, I saw his car start up and he drove away perfectly fine. It didn't look like he needed a jump at all, in fact. So, why was he asking me for a jump if his car would start up just fine? What would have happened if I actually did try to go and help this guy? I know that I could be overreacting, but to me the whole situation seemed very suspicious. My grandma always said a man would never ask a woman for help, especially with a car, and my boyfriend said one time that he wouldn't even approach a female at night just for the simple fact that it might make them uncomfortable. I told him what happened, and he said that it was very weird as well. I don't know if it could have been a trafficking tactic, a kidnapping tactic, etc., but it was definitely strange. One of my friends joked that someone could be watching my house, and I get that they were trying to be funny and lighten the mood, but it's definitely kind of scary when you have an experience like that. Especially because if someone was watching my house, they would know that I was completely alone for a few hours at night. Anyway, do you guys have any thoughts? I'm still trying to wrap my head around this and figure out if I'm just overreacting or not. This was just a few nights ago, and honestly, I've been kind of scared of going out to my car or just being alone in general at night since then. I guess I'm just wondering if maybe somebody is watching my house. And if they are, what should I do? So this was back about 12 years ago. I was 19 years old, 32 now, and my dumb ass decided that it was a great idea to join the group of people who came to my door to try and sell magazines. I had just gotten out of a relationship and wasn't working, so why not, right? To start, it was shady as heck, but I didn't care. They all partied and made a few bucks to boot. I thought, what could go wrong? I started in New Hampshire, and by the second week was across the country in some hillbilly town in Alabama. I walk up to this woman sitting on her porch, and I try to sell her some magazines. I notice that she's drinking and ask if I could have one. I'm almost done with my sales for the day after all. The woman is about 5'9", I guess, 300 pounds, maybe around age 40 to 50 if I had to guess. I don't think much of it. I mean, it's a woman, I'm a woman, what could go wrong? I walk into a house and I see a huge cage with a wolf in it. Yeah, a wolf growling at me. Still, I'm pretty ballsy, so I don't think much of it. The woman offers me a drink and we small talk, and before I know it, she is in my face accusing me of stealing her wallet. I hadn't left her sight, mind you, but she threatens to let her wolf out. I am literally in shock because I now know that she is a complete psycho. After about 10 minutes of her threatening my life, me crying, saying that I'm not a thief, she then just starts laughing. She says, "How old are you?" I tell her my age. She then goes on to say that this is a life lesson. Don't go into strangers' houses. She apparently knew exactly where her wallet was the whole time. She then tells me to get the heck out of her house and leave this neighborhood and never come back. And all I can say is, well, I guess she had good intentions, but for 10 minutes of my life, I genuinely thought that I was a wolf's dinner and an old hick lady's amusement. So I just recently moved to Oklahoma, and I keep having very uncomfortable experiences outside, especially in the evening or nighttime. It started when I went to go out to put laundry in the wash one day. We have a laundry room attached to our building, and it was broad daylight, so I wasn't exactly feeling nervous about anything. I got about 20 feet from the walkway or alleyway to the washroom, and I smelled the worst rotting animal smell that I've ever smelt in my life. Not only that though, but as soon as I smelt it, I got the strongest flight or fight reaction that I've ever felt. I ran back to my unit, locked the door, and had a sort of small anxiety attack, I guess. I waited about 15 to 20 minutes before going back out, and when I did, there was no smell and I felt normal. Well, fast forward about a week later, my husband and I were outside at 1 a.m. smoking a cigarette when we heard what sounded like a dying dog. We live right off of one of the major interstates, so we assumed an animal must have been hit. We started walking towards the direction of this noise, sort of wheezing and whining, a terribly sad noise. And when we got to the edge of the parking lot, as we got onto the pavement, the wheezing dog noise turned into what sounded like an owl hooting. I understand owls making strange noises. I was raised in Texas after all. I've heard many, but this was not an owl. The longer we listened to it as well, the more it sounded like a person trying to mimic an owl. My husband called out, "Hey, is somebody there?" pretty loudly, and just silence was the response. We stood quiet a few moments before the owl noise completely stopped, and the sound of an unnatural laugh echoed from the trees. Now, the only way that I can describe this noise is it was like when a deaf person laughs. Like they can't hear how they sound, so it just kind of sounds a bit off. I don't mean to sound rude at all by any means, truly. That's just really the only way that I know how to describe sort of what it sounded like. It felt like ice water was in my veins, though, as soon as I heard it. Both of us just felt extreme fear in that moment, and we ran back into the house. And I could explain off all of these things if I hadn't seen what I had seen next. So a few days later, I was outside smoking around 7 p.m, and I saw two men walking on the side of the street where I had heard the noise a few nights prior. They walked past the trees a little ways, but then stopped. It was dusk, so light was low. One of them turned on their phone light and shined it into the trees before sort of jumping back. Both men took off at full sprint away from the tree line. I have no idea what they saw. I didn't hear anything, but there was pure fear there. The most frustrating part, though, was I was looking right at them and I saw absolutely nothing. Fast forward about a week later, though, and I get a text while I'm at work from my husband telling me that he heard our daughter talking and laughing in the field across the street. He was 100% sure it was her until he realized that she was inside of her room. He said, though, that it sounded just like her. Fast forward again a few days later, and I found dried blood on my door jamb, as well as scratches near my doorknob, and more dried blood at the bottom of my door. My neighbor, too, had their internet cables cut and told me that someone had tried to open their door the night that it happened, and then slammed their body against the door trying to break in. My neighbor said that he forced himself out the door ready to confront whoever was there, but when they did, there was no one. Mind you, they had just popped out, just after whatever was banging on their door slammed against it, so that just makes no sense. We constantly hear things on the roof too, things in the valley behind our place. Our dog will run to the door at random hours and sniff and growl like somebody is there. I've probably made a mistake by calling out to this thing, whistling at night, trying to sort of antagonize it, I guess, because I desperately want a recording. I have one recording of its noises, and it sounds just like an owl, but towards the end there's this sort of low, inexplicable moan that comes from the same place the owl sounds are coming from. It's hard to hear it and ends very abruptly, so I don't feel like it's good enough. But nobody believes me. But I know something is out there. It knows that I know it too. I feel it sort of watching me. If I curse at it or try and lure it out, it goes completely silent or does that horrible laugh. I can never seem to catch the laugh too, or any of the noises. As soon as I hit record, it usually just stops. I don't know how to explain that too, but I know that I'm not going crazy. Anyway, please, if someone can help me, I really want to know what this thing is. I have pictures of the blood on my door, the scratches, and the video of the owl, the sounds and the moaning. I just feel like no one would take this seriously, though. It always smells like a corpse when it's around, too, and that's the biggest sign that something just isn't right. I brought it up to one of my native co-workers, and he said, "Leave it be, wash the blood from your door, and stop trying to talk to it." He wouldn't tell me anything else. I don't know if this means that it's a Wendigo or a skinwalker or something else entirely, but I've never felt such, dread and fear as I do when I hear or smell it out there. Please, anyone, if you know what this is, then please tell me I'm not losing my mind, and if it's real, how do I make it go away? This thing is causing me so much stress, and I've just had enough, and I want this to end. So I'm 20 now, and this took place when I was 13 to 14 years old. I think it's also important that I note that I've always been a bigger, older-looking guy. At the time of this story, I was roughly 6'1", 200 pounds, and was in moderately decent shape since it was football season. I guess I just thought since I was such a big guy, nothing could ever happen to me. But this story is about the night that proved me wrong. So one night, I had gotten into an argument with my parents and needed to take a walk to blow off some steam. I had set a route I'd usually take to get to this park located on the other side of my neighborhood. By the time that I arrived at the park, nightfall had fully set in. I made my way to the only lit-up corner of the park, sat down at a bench, and began listening to my music on my phone. I should note that I was completely comfortable dropping my guard, as this was during a time when my relationship with my family was a bit strained, so coming here had become something of a regular occurrence. A few songs in, I noticed a car pull up on the unlit side of the park, which proceeded to immediately turn its headlights off. It was a silver SUV, but I couldn't tell what model or how many people were in the vehicle from where I was sitting. I didn't think much of it at first, as this really wasn't anything out of the ordinary. My neighborhood is rather large and divided into multiple parts, so people would frequently get lost trying to navigate it. I simply assumed that the driver had stopped to pull up directions on their phone or something. But a good nearly 10 minutes would pass and the vehicle still hadn't moved, which began to make me a bit nervous for some reason. The thought crossed my mind that whoever was in that car may be watching me, and as unlikely as that thought seemed, it was enough to get me to leave the park. As I was getting up, the vehicle turned its headlights back on, and at that, a sick feeling formed in my stomach, and I quickly made my way out of the park, breaking my usual route to ensure that I didn't have to go near that car. At this point, I didn't know what to do, to be honest. I wanted to call my mum to come and pick me up, but given the argument that we just had, I stupidly convinced myself that calling her wouldn't be the right thing to do. I made my way to the end of the block, mentally preparing myself to wrap around the block and start heading back in the direction of the park that was my only way home. Just seconds later, though, as I reached the end of the block, the same car pulled out in front of me and came to a screeching stop. Not quite processing what was happening, I simply stopped walking and watched as the driver, an older man with a baseball cap and an unsettling smile that I could just barely make out in the darkness of his car, says, "Hey, you okay, buddy? You need a ride somewhere?" There wasn't anything out of the ordinary about his voice, but as he spoke to me, my stomach tied itself in knots. All I could do was mutter out a soft no before the man reached all the way over and opened the passenger side door. "Hop in, we can go anywhere you like, buddy." Snapping out of my state of shock, I darted off behind the car without saying another word. I heard the man try to call out to me as I had started running, but I couldn't make it out. I heard his car speed off as I continued trying to put as much distance between me and him as I possibly could. I made it a good few blocks away before I felt comfortable enough to stop running, and decided to finally start making my way back home. Not long after, though, I heard a car coming up behind me in a quick stop, which made my heart feel like it was about to shoot out of my chest. My nerves settled pretty quickly as I realized that it was my mum, who set out to look for me after I didn't come home. She rolled down her window and began yelling at me to get in the car, but Something was off in her voice. She didn't sound angry, but more panicked, I guess. I did as she said, asking what was wrong as we pulled off, and she told me that she had just been by the park to look for me and saw a car which had the same description as the one that I encountered, partially blocking the road to shine its headlights into the park. She says that as she pulled up, the car quickly pulled back out and sped off. Call it mother's intuition, I guess, but she immediately assumed that I was involved somehow. Though I denied anything happening, as I've never really been someone who can talk about anything real with my family, my mum still reported the car to the police, and that was that. I've never told my family what really happened, and haven't really ever spoken about this until, well, now, really. This situation didn't stop me from going out for walks when I needed to de-stress, and I guess you can just credit that to me being a stupid teenage boy. I was certainly more cautious of my surroundings, but like I said, that was that. I never saw the man again, and I moved on with my life. I can look back now, though, and use this as an interesting story to tell people, I guess, but I truly was incredibly lucky to get out of that situation unharmed, I think. Who knows what would have happened if I hadn't decided to leave that park, or if I hadn't been able to get away. Would I really have been able to bring myself to fight back if needed? Maybe I wouldn't be here now, or maybe I'd be left with much, much worse memories of that night. All I can say without a doubt is that that man had truly awful intentions. Of that much I'm sure, and I am very lucky to be here now. Moral of the story: be careful when you go out for walks at night. Always be aware of your surroundings. It doesn't matter who you are, how big you are. Anything can happen if someone has bad enough intentions. So, we were going on a hike one day, and there's this spooky abandoned train tunnel in my state where a bunch of people died like 100 years ago, so now it's allegedly haunted. I brought one friend with me on the hike since it was a long one. The area and the scenery were beautiful, but the tunnel itself was something else. My buddy, his name is Ed, was a bit more nervous than me and didn't want to go too far in. I wanted to go as far as I could, which turned out not to be far because the tunnel was blocked by impassable debris. But wait, there was a small hole in the side of the debris mound, and it turns out that I could crawl through it. So I asked, "Hey Ed, you feel like crawling?" "Nah, no thanks, dude." So I took my pack off and coat and I squirmed through on my own. On the other side was the rest of the tunnel, but with water that went up to nearly the top of the mound on the other side, as far as the eye can see. I was disappointed too, because I would have to swim in ice-cold, nasty water for who knows how long to keep exploring. So I decided no and to crawl back. My buddy Ed was nervous, but we weren't done yet. Next, we busted out just one tool for detecting ghosts, an EMF reader. As someone who is pretty scientific, I guess you could say, I tested it multiple times and made sure that it was working before bringing it. We decided to try and contact ghosts in the tunnel. I was pretty confident nothing would happen. We turned off all of our electronics and lights so it was pitch black and just the EMF reader on. I asked pretty basic questions, I guess you could say, to the ghosts. Asked it to come in front of my scanner so I'd know that it was there, etc. We did this for a while too, and there was nothing. No reading, no surprise, and so we headed back. We decided to keep my EMF reader on, and then as we're sort of walking back, suddenly it goes to 2 lights. I thought maybe our flashlights were causing it, so we turned them off. But no, still 2 lights. I reset the device, 2 solid lights. I say, that's interesting, maybe something's here. My adrenaline started flowing into my body now, but I was still skeptical. I started asking it questions again, and then my EMF signal got even stronger. And we both were getting chills, and the hairs on our skin were standing up. And it was around this time that we heard something. Kind of sounded like a distant cough, I guess you could say, but it was so fast that it was easy to dismiss it. I reset the device again, still getting a strong signal from something, and it's definitely not coming from us. I then said, "Is it alright if we stay in the tunnel with you a bit longer?" The meter instantly went back to 0. I was surprised, but confident now. I asked, "Do you want us to leave?" Then, it instantly went back up to high. I was pretty convinced at this point, so we headed for the entrance to the tunnel and we discussed our experience. However, when we were at the entrance, we noticed that the EMF was picking up another signal, just above and to the side of us now, and if you pointed it in a different direction, there was nothing. After that, we left, but we think that ghosts may have been hanging out by the entrance, waiting for us to leave. You could always say that the EMF was faulty, I know that, or picking up something else, but I'm sure that that device was working. I tested it so many times before and after, and there was nothing on us producing the EMF reading. Also, considering that we didn't get any reading in there for the vast majority of the time that we were there, that says something too. But that cough of all things, that sounded so much like a person, and it was truly mind-boggling, and I'm still processing it. So this occurred a bit over a year ago now. Me and my girlfriend decided to have a date night at the beach, figuring that there'd be less people if we were there during the evening hours and it'd be cooler out. Important to note too is that we're both young women, 20 female and 23 female, but I in particular have a younger looking face. So, we came with our bathing suits, found a quiet area away from everyone, and put down our towel to hold hands and look at the stars and waves. It was a super nice time too until, well, the creep approached. Dude approached us from the direction of the general entrance area, looked about mid-30s. I'm going to try and paraphrase too here a bit, but he said something along the lines of, "Hey, me and my family are new to this area. My wife and my 4-year-old daughter want to sit with someone so we can be a little less lonely and make some friends. Can we sit with you guys?" It was weird vibes immediately. It was like 9:30 PM at this point, and we were distance away from people already hanging out here. Who would bring a 4-year-old out to a beach this late anyway? Why would you want to sit with some strangers, and why would a family choose to hang out with some college-aged women? This was clearly just made-up stuff, and also, of course, no woman and child matching that description was in sight. My girlfriend and I, we politely declined, but he becomes more and more insistent and animated. I start to panic and fumble for my pepper spray in my tote bag. I was nervous and trying to be discreet, but it took an agonizing amount of time to find it at the bottom of our towels. Somehow he didn't notice, and once I had it clutched, we got a little more bold, trying to get him to go. Girlfriend lies and says that we're underage. The guy gets visibly mad at this and says, "No, you're not." I respond, spray in hand, "Dude, you need to leave." And the look that he gave us was the absolute scariest thing. He took a step back and looked at both of us like he was sizing us up. Then he goes, "You guys are liars," and wanders away. We watch him, and the dude does not return to a wife and kid. Me and my girlfriend go back to our car ASAP, and we called the police. The sketchy vibe was unreal, and we gave them his description, and we just took off. As far as we know, nothing ever came of it, and the question that we still have is, what was this dude trying to do? He wasn't under the influence as far as we could tell, and his story seemed so rehearsed. But we still theorize on what his plan was, and neither of us came to reach a conclusion about what could have happened that night. And I'm sharing this because I would like your thoughts and theories. What do you think he was up to? So, for context, this happened 20 years ago, just after Christmas. I had just turned 6 a month prior. My mum went out one day and left my then 16-year-old cousin to look after me and my 2 older siblings, brother 8 and sister 11. My cousin decided to take us out to the city, which is about 10 minutes from where we lived. We took the bus, walked around the city in incredibly unsafe neighborhoods with basically another child responsible for us, and after hours got tired and decided to go home. The city had a central area for the buses, not a bus station but like a sort of huge, perfectly square field with some plants and flowers and bushes. Lining all four sides along the streets were a couple bus stops and benches, so basically you could catch several different buses from that area going all over the county or city. Since it was just after Christmas too, the bushes along the field were still covered in Christmas lights. As we waited for the bus, I began to wander away as I admired the lights, my cousin none the wiser. And at some point, I heard a man say hi. I looked up from the bush and he was smiling down at me. Thinking back on it once I got older, it was clear that he was homeless and was probably on drugs too. He had long brownish sort of hair that was wet, teeth that were black along the gums, and his clothes were incredibly dirty and torn, and he had several jackets on. None of this really registered in my 6-year-old brain, so I just smiled back and said hi. He asked if I liked looking at the lights, and I said yes, they're pretty. He said, and I'll never forget this exact sentence, "If you like Christmas lights, I've got some really cool lights at my house that you'll love. You want to come and see them?" I eagerly said yes, so he reached down his hand to me and I took it. We started to walk away and were headed to the corner of the field where a few big buildings were. He said his apartment was just a couple of blocks away, so we were headed around the corner of the building when my arm jerked backwards and I turned to see my sister pulling me away from him. This guy too, he didn't say a single word. He just took off, instantly running. It took a few years for me to fully grasp the danger that I was in that day. My sister and brother talked about what happened a lot and how scary it was. When I finally got a little bit older, I appreciated how terrifying that all was and how close I was to having my life change or perhaps even end forever. If I had rounded that city corner with him, they never would have been able to find me in time because they wouldn't even know where to start looking before we disappeared around the corner and into the city. It's something that we still bring up sometimes to this day, and it always makes me feel really icky. On my 19th birthday in September of 2014, I'd moved into my first home, a small one-bed flat. I was beyond excited to have the freedom and independence that living alone would offer me, and quickly set out about buying new furniture, decorations, and items for my new home. One afternoon on the bus home after a trip into my local town to buy more household items, an elderly gentleman, in his late 60s if I had to guess, started speaking to me. I've always been a social person that'll pretty much gladly speak to whoever speaks to me, so I engaged him in the conversation. Just sort of polite chit-chat about what we'd been up to that day, what our plans were for the rest of it. But upon reaching the stop that I'd be getting off at, he told me that he was also getting off at this stop as he was visiting a friend who lived in a neighbouring block of flats. He offered to help me carry my shopping, and I agreed. I walked with him to the front of my block and said my goodbyes. He left towards a different block, and honestly, I thought that was that. He didn't enter my building or see which flat belonged to me, or so I thought at least. A few days later, I heard a knock upon my door. I opened it to find the same elderly gentleman standing outside my door. I was quite taken aback considering that he shouldn't have known which flat I actually lived in. He'd also managed to get into the building without ringing my doorbell, and the realization hit me that he would have had to have hidden out of sight to watch which flat that I entered. The block had large windows in the communal area. He quickly forced his way into my home and tried talking to me. I lied and stated that I was about to leave as my friends were expecting me, hoping that this would encourage him to go. He then started trying to grope me under my clothes, and I moved his hands away, but he kept trying to remove them. I ran to my front door and told him I'm leaving and you need to go. Luckily, he did, but he loitered. I waited to make sure that he'd walk away before walking in an opposite direction and immediately called my dad in tears. We rang the police, who were as unhelpful as they could possibly be, really. 2 female officers who asked me, why did you let him into the flat, despite me saying that he'd forced his way in. They encouraged me to not press charges as the name and the address that he'd given me in our first exchange were falsified, telling me that it would be difficult to prove, a lot of paperwork, and you'd have to relive it in court if we did manage to find him. I regretfully agreed. I was shocked and scared, and the police already were so unsupportive anyway. But it doesn't end there, though. This man continued to stalk me for months, regularly appearing at my door, following me when I was out. It wasn't until he was on the same bus as me to town when I went to meet friends that it finally stopped, as this was the first time that I was able to point him out to somebody else. My friends went over and publicly called him out for stalking and harassing me. They threatened him, saying, "If we ever hear of you doing this again, you'll not be able to use those arms to abuse another person ever again. Leave our friend alone." He quickly scampered away, and thankfully, that was the last that I ever saw of him. But this incident, it shook me. It all happened simply because I was polite to a seemingly innocent elderly man who wanted to help me and make conversation. Needless to say, I've never accepted another offer of helping me carry my shopping ever again. I guess the lesson here is be careful who you let help you, because it might not be good intentions that they have in mind. Never trust a Smile again. The hit horror movie Smile is now streaming on Paramount+. After witnessing a bizarre, traumatic incident involving a patient, Dr. Rose Cotter starts experiencing frightening occurrences that she can't explain. As an overwhelming terror begins taking over her life, Rose must confront her troubling past in order to survive and escape her horrifying new reality. How far will Rose go to find out what's behind a smile? I could not recommend this movie more for anyone who enjoys psychological horror. From the phenomenal soundtrack that gets under your skin to the great overall pacing coupled with the really interesting cinematography, the film has a great amount of suspense to keep you consistently gripped until the next scene. Sosie Bacon stars in Smile, now streaming on Paramount+. Rated R. Head to ParamountPlus.com to try it free. I grew up in a sleepy suburb in South Carolina in an upper-middle-class neighborhood. The neighborhood was built on the side of a small antebellum period slave plantation that had fallen to decay more than a century ago. My house was situated directly across the street from the plantation's old cemetery. I put that in quotes because there are no headstones, only crudely cut rocks that signified where people were already buried. There was only one bedroom in our house that overlooked the cemetery, and it was the one that I slept in as a child. When I was very young, I would always comment on seeing shadow people, dark humanoid shapes that would dance in and out of your peripheral vision. I'd be sitting in the living room playing with my DS or something like that, and see something walk across the adjoining kitchen, only to look up and see nothing. This was also a relatively common occurrence in this house. The worst thing, though, was the nightmares that I'd have in my childhood bedroom. Man, the nightmares. Before I was old enough to even watch my first horror movie, I would have these intense, graphic dreams. Nothing a child's brain should be able to conjure up like that. I had one reoccurring dream, too, where I would go to the bathroom only to find a person void of any skin weeping in a blood-filled bathtub. Yeah, terrible nightmares. The dreams were often hyper-realistic too, and would take place in my home with no alterations. I would often refuse to sleep in that room as well. The house was 2 stories, and I would often just fall asleep on a patch of carpet next to the stairs. When my sister moved out, I finally got out of that room. The nightmares and the insomnia stopped too, almost instantaneously. But that room is used as my dad's office space now. I always make an effort to shut the door every night before I go to bed, but when I wake up to use the bathroom, it's always open without fail. I admit that it could be a draft, but the problem continued even after we replaced the doorknob. Even in the blazing hot South Carolina summer, that room too is always freezing cold. It'd be easy to chalk it up to childhood superstition, I know, but the strange occurrences continued well into my late teens. Now, my parents were always out of town on business, leaving 17-year-old me to my own devices for weeks at a time sometimes. I hated being in that house too alone, so I'd always have a few people spending the night while they were gone. My house began to build a bit of a reputation with my circle of friends as well. The first instance that I can think of was in my junior year of high school. I was with 4 friends and we decided to grab a pizza. One of the other friends decided to stay at the house and watch some TV and just keep an eye on my dog. And about 10 minutes after we left, I got a call from my friend and he seems genuinely shaken and told me to hurry up. It's about 10:30 p.m. at this point. He had put my dog on his leash and they were both standing in the driveway of my house when we got back. He said that shortly after we left, he heard loud banging coming from the upstairs of my house. We have a long hallway on the second story, and he said that it sounded like multiple people running full sprint from one side to the other, just over and over again. My dog was apparently going ballistic, and he grabbed his leash and the both of them just ran outside. Needless to say, he wasn't willing to stay that night. Another instance is just me and one of my friends. My parents had been out of town for a few days, so we were just having some brews and playing COD or something on the TV in my living room. It was getting super late, so we put on a movie and we sort of conked out after about an hour. I left him on the couch and went to sleep in my bedroom. But at around 3:30, I get shaken awake by my terrified friend. He said that he woke up and was freezing cold, so he walked upstairs to grab a blanket out of the linen closet. He said that when he closed the door, he could barely make out my dog in front of him. My friend called to him and reached out his hand to pet him, but when he did, the shadow sort of drifted across the ground towards him and went through his legs. Not through the middle of his legs, like physically through his legs. He asked me to feel them too, and they were icy to the touch. We both just sort of hung out in the living room with pretty much every light in the house on after that. But the last story that I have has to do with my dog and my childhood bedroom about 2 years ago. My parents were yet again out of town and asked me to dog sit the floofer, and of course I obliged. It was around 9:30 on a hot summer night, and my dog just starts going absolutely ballistic for some reason and running around in circles almost like he was chasing something. He bolted it upstairs, still barking, until I hear him make it to the far side of the house, near my childhood bedroom, and the next thing that I hear is the door slam shut. It was incredibly loud, and there was obviously a lot of force behind it. Then all I could hear was him shrieking, almost like he was in severe pain. He's a fairly large lab husky chow mix, and I've never heard him make a sound like this. I, terrified, sprinted up the stairs after him and opened up the door to let him out. He came thundering out of the room and was desperately clawing at the door to the backyard. And I couldn't get him to come inside for like 2 days after that, leaving his food and water outside for him. Now, I mark myself as the superstitious type, but only because so much weird stuff has happened to me in that house throughout the years. I just get an angry foreboding feeling when I come back home these days. Am I crazy for believing that there's something else that I can't explain in that house? I felt insane until my friend started to see and experience the same stuff that I did. My mum won't even have a conversation with me about the prospect of something malicious being in that upstairs office space. And although this is extremely long-winded, I could honestly write a novel with how many more stories I have about this house. But I'll leave it for here for now, and I'm just wondering if there's anyone else living in the Deep South that has experienced anything like this, like seeing shadow people and stuff like that. I'd love for all of this to be easily dismissible, and on their own each story is, I guess, but with the years and years of strange occurrences, I just can't chalk it up to coincidence anymore. Anyways, that's my story or stories. I'm just confused and struggling to make sense of any of this. Hopefully somebody can shed a little bit of light at least on what's going on, either in that house or perhaps even the cemetery across the street. This happened late in November of 2017, and it was a weekday. I can't remember what day exactly, but I knew that it wasn't a weekend as the roads were pretty desolate. I was 33 at that stage, and we'd been working for a family on a ranch for about 4 years, and they'd become like our second family, I suppose. We were on work visas from South Africa, so not native to the US, but pretty familiar with everything as we had been in the area for the full 4 years that we had worked for them. We decided to make the career and life change after I got burnt out at 29 in a corporate marketing career that wasn't going anywhere and was stealing my soul and will to live. We just wanted to scale down and have a more relaxed lifestyle, I suppose. Anyway, the ranch was in northern Utah, somewhere between Salt Lake City and Logan. I'm being pretty vague as the family is very well known and I would not like to identify them as a respect for their privacy. But we were almost getting ready to return to South Africa at that stage as our visas were running out and we wanted a bit of a holiday, I guess, as it had been a very busy year. Getting married, our daughter was born, etc. So we wanted to do a bit of sightseeing before we returned, and the owner offered to pay for the accommodation and provide spending money and his truck even if we would run an errand for him on the way. He had a couple of horses and a trailer that needed to be picked up from a ranch somewhere in Wyoming, with Cheyenne being the closest big city more than an hour away. We jumped at the opportunity as we basically had a week to get there and then a day to get back to his ranch. We visited some awesome places too: Park City, Flaming Gorge, Bear Lake, Yellowstone, Teton Village, etc. The whole trip was an amazing experience, except for the incident this story is about. That definitely put a bit of a damper on the excitement. We drove up to Park City the first day and spent the night with some friends there. And the incident happened on the second day of the trip, on the way between Flaming Gorge Reservoir and Bear Lake via Green River. So, we were driving and enjoying the scenery and had just crossed over the Utah-Wyoming border when we spotted the only vehicle for the past maybe 30-odd miles. An old red-brown pickup truck that was parked on the opposite side of the road. There were two guys inside, and when we were about maybe 150 feet from them, they pulled onto the road to make a U-turn. I was pretty annoyed by that as I was doing about 80 at the time and had to make a hard brake and swerve onto the oncoming traffic to avoid having an accident with them. I punched on the horn and flipped the middle finger out the window when I passed them too. They sped up, flashing the lights behind me, but I just punched it and left them behind. I was driving my employer's new Ram 2500 diesel truck, so it had no shortage in power to get away. A few miles down the road, I couldn't see them behind me anymore, so I assumed that they must have turned off. Probably about 40 to 50 miles up the road, we pulled into a Little America to get diesel and some food. When we got out of the shop, we saw the truck parked across the lot, but nobody was in it. We decided to load up and head out as I wasn't in the mood for an argument with some redneck cowboys. So we headed out and thought that was the last that we would see of them. But boy, were we wrong. We were looking for interesting places to stop and things to see on the route, and about 45 minutes or so after we left Little America, we spotted a sign that pointed to Fossil Butte National Monument. We pulled in and literally had the place to ourselves. But we were the only car in the parking lot, so we walked around and couldn't see much as it was closed, so we decided to head out. But right as we got to the truck, we spotted the red pickup speeding into the parking lot. I panicked, my wife jumped into the back with our 5-month-old daughter, and I ran around and jumped into the driver's seat. Right as I wanted to pull out, the pickup pulled in behind us, blocking us from exiting. I was terrified at this point, screaming at my wife to call 911. The two guys jumped out of the truck and started running towards us, one on each side of the truck. Only then did I notice that both had their faces covered by what looked like handkerchiefs, like what cowboys usually wear around their necks. Right at this time as well, my wife said, panicking, that she didn't have cell service. I was making split-second decisions and noticed that, except for the curve and a signpost off to the left, there was nothing really solid in front of the truck. So I threw the truck into drive, swung the steering to the right and floored it. The truck bounced over the curb, plowed through the sagebrush, and made a wide turn through the field back toward the parking area, and we raced for the exit. Now, the layout of the parking lot was as follows. There's a one-way entrance, the road splits, and the parking runs into a one-way loop that exits at the same entrance. If it doesn't make sense, then you can pull it up on Google Maps with satellite view. That will explain it a little bit better. We were parked at the far end of the parking lot though, and we were now going through the parking the wrong way to get out. The other guys were back in their truck racing to cut us off. They beat us to the entrance too, as they had a much shorter distance to cover than we did. They proceeded to park their truck sideways across the road by the gate, so there was no way that we could get around without causing some serious damage to my boss's brand new truck. We stopped about 150 feet from them. One guy had an aluminum bat and the other had some sort of a bar or tire iron that he was swinging around. My wife was crying in panic, our daughter was screaming, and I was shaking from adrenaline and fear. And even though the situation was still dodgy, I felt like we were out of immediate danger at this point. The two guys didn't move towards us, just standing next to their truck staring us down. It felt like hours, but was probably less than a few minutes, and I told my wife to buckle our daughter in and look behind the seat for the rifle my boss kept there. She found it and passed it to me. I wasn't worried about the bat and the bar, but in case one of them had a firearm. Obviously, I didn't want to make the situation worse, so I was still contemplating whether I should use it if they approached or threatened us again, when I noticed a camper turning off the highway towards us. The two guys must have also noticed, as they looked at each other, got in their truck, and at that they just sped off. They turned the way that we came from onto the highway, and we could no longer see them, and so we started driving. We passed the camper and the old couple gave us a friendly wave. We wonder if they knew that to us they were angels sent from heaven that day, or probably not, right? And the story ends there, pretty anticlimactically. We had a pretty amazing but uneventful, at least if you count dodgy encounters, rest of the trip. We told my boss what happened when we returned, and his explanation was that they were probably looking for trouble, and that is why they cut us off with the U-turn, and then when people react, they start a confrontation. It sounded plausible at that stage, until about a week later when we were already back in South Africa. I was lying in bed one night thinking over the encounter when it just sort of struck me. From where we first encountered them, when they cut us off with the U-turn, until the Fossil Butte Visitor Center, was over 3 hours and close to about 120 miles. You don't follow someone that far unless you have some seriously sinister intentions. They also must have purposely followed us there, as there are many different routes that they could have taken that would have led them away from us, and we turned off the interstate and made about 2 or 3 other turns since leaving Little America too. And that certainly made me lie awake for a few more hours, wondering just what their intentions were and what would have happened if that old couple with the camper didn't turn off right when they did. Nearly 2 years ago now, my husband and I moved to a pretty safe town. We decided to have some fun while we were young and child-free, so we got an apartment downtown. It was super fun. It's on the top of a shopping center with restaurants, boutiques, a theater, all kinds of stuff. We had a blast living there too, and have always felt very safe. Now, I like to go on walks. Since the area is so busy, I've always just sort of walked here and there when I'm alone. I go on a walk about every other day, less in the winter. But for 2 years, I've seen this older man sitting in the shopping center. He always gave me a really bad feeling though, so if I came upon him, I tried to divert my path. But I felt sort of bad for judging, I guess. I said to myself, maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe he's just old and lonely and wants to be out and around people, right? Well, the other night, there was apparently a shooting in the shopping center. It was around 8 o'clock at night, and I never go out that late by myself, so I didn't even know about it until the next morning. It turns out that some older man had kidnapped a woman in the shopping center at gunpoint, assaulted her and tried to drive away with her even. Her husband drove after them and shot at the guy. She was rescued and he's apparently now in jail. He admitted to the police that he's been stalking that shopping centre for victims, watching the women around there, and I cannot tell you just how many times in the past 2 years that I have crossed paths with this guy. How many times I felt guilty for feeling uncomfortable around him. How many times I was right in his path, an easy target even. I guess the moral of the story is always trust your gut. Always. This story happened a few years ago. I was in my early 20s and was studying in Paris, France. I was going home from uni. I usually took a short bus ride and walked the rest of the way. That day, I felt slightly uncomfortable though. I could sense some guy looking intensely at me. I was used to unpleasant, unsolicited gazes, but this time his gaze felt sort of beastly. It's hard to explain why, but I felt like a prey being stalked. I decided to get off the bus a few stops early. I wanted to avoid him and didn't want him to see where I usually got off. Like I learned in the movies, I waited until someone else pressed the stop button and waited until the last moment to stand up and leave. I didn't notice him get off the bus though. Just as I was feeling the relief of having escaped an uncomfortable situation, I looked over my shoulder and there he was, a few meters behind me. I had the distressing feeling his eye had just looked away the moment that I turned. I walked into a shop quickly, took my phone and pretended to be taking a call, and when I couldn't see him anymore, I exited and made my way home as fast as I could. I kept looking back on the busy street. I zigzagged, crossed the street at every crossing, and finally I believed that him getting off at the same stop as me was just a coincidence. When I reached my building, I looked back one last time, and there he was again, his alarming gaze on me, smirking. I ran up to my apartment, climbing the stairs 4 at a time. I reached the top floor, squeezed through my door, locked it, and froze. My intercom was now ringing. Don't ask me why I picked it up. I regretted it the moment that I did, but I could hear the opposite flat intercom ringing as well. He had pressed all the buttons one by one, hoping that someone would open, but now he knew my name. Gabriel. I felt like a deer in the headlights, frozen. "Open the door, please," said a pleading voice. "I just want to talk to you." Somehow, I couldn't even move or speak. "Come to the window," he added. "Look at me. You'll see I'm not a bad guy." Something clicked. He wanted to locate my apartment in the building. I was not going to make that mistake, though. I hung up in shock. I waited by the door without moving for what seemed like hours. When I finally managed to calm myself, I called my long-distance boyfriend. "Call the police," he said immediately. Why didn't I call the police? I don't know. Today, it would be the first thing that I would do. The fear of making a big deal out of something not important, perhaps. What an idiot I was, though. I called my best friend instead. I just didn't want to feel alone, I guess. I told her all about it, and after a while, I felt a bit safer. We started laughing, and suddenly the intercom rang again. 2 hours had passed since I'd come home. I answered. "Gabriel," said the voice. "Open, please." I still remember the chills that I felt that day. He was still there. He was there all this time. I was silent, petrified. He was silent, but I could sense his trepidation. "Gabriel, let me in. I'm so thirsty," he said. "Just give me a glass of water." This broke the tension, and I hung up. Curled up in a corner, literally in recovery position, terrified, I waited. I was scared to make a sound. I knew that he couldn't hear me from the hall, but I was scared to even breathe. The intercom rang again, and again. I didn't answer this time. Instead, I crouched to the sofa and just fell asleep in exhaustion. But I did hear the intercom ring one more time, in the middle of the night. I woke up in the morning, afraid to leave my apartment. I called my dad, who came to pick me up. There was no one in the hall, but there was a note in my mailbox. It said, "Gabriel, I'm a nice guy. You should have opened to me." We immediately went to the nearest police station, and the police listened, and of course they told me that I should not hesitate to call them. My dad called a locksmith to install digicode on the building door the same day, and wrote a message to each of my neighbors asking to not open the door to anyone that they didn't expect. He sat in the cafe in front of my building with two friends every evening for more than a week, but I never saw the stalker again. After this episode, I use a different route to and from uni every day. I kept my phone tightly in my hand and looked back every few meters. Today, I'm still very observing of my surroundings. I never enter the door if I'm not expecting someone. So, people, if you ever find yourself in any kind of uncomfortable situation like this, trust me, call the police. And don't be an idiot like me. So this happened almost 10 years ago, but it still gives me the creeps whenever I think about it. I was finished college, living back with my parents in our sleepy little town, and had rekindled an old friendship from high school to pass my days. Madison was a chill girl, and I got along pretty well with her boyfriend and brothers, so I ended up spending a fair amount of time over there at her place. Madison's mum was a nurse who enjoyed training for marathons, so if she wasn't at work, she was usually out running. Her dad, on the other hand, was off on disability and home every day, except for delivering the paper around the neighborhood at about 4 a.m. Through passing conversation with Madison, I learned that he had been a professor before going off work, but I didn't feel it was my place to inquire further than that. He was never anything but pleasant to me during our interactions, but I was always struck with the notion that he seemed very distracted by something, as if there was always another conversation happening that he needed to return to. My parents are the type who always have questions about my friends, even if I was a 22-year-old college student. So I filled them in on what I knew and where I had been spending my afternoons. My mum asked me if I knew what her dad was off on disability for. I told her I didn't know, at which point my dad piped up and said that he believes that he deals with some mental illness. He then gently explained that he had responded to a 911 call with the volunteer fire department to go retrieve Madison's father out of the garage after a failed, attempt. Hearing that, my heart went out to everyone involved, and my questions surrounding her dad were satisfied, I guess. But I continued hanging around with Madison and her family for the rest of the summer, never having any issues besides perhaps a hangover the next day. One night, though, we were all over at Madison's house celebrating someone's birthday, I think. Everyone was congregating in the kitchen, sharing snacks, drinking wine, dancing. Even Madison's parents were down and having a good time with us. But her dad came over to me calmly with his drink and asked if he could speak to me in another room just off of the kitchen. I agreed and followed him, thinking that he was probably going to ask me to move my car or something. When we got into the other room, I could see the concerned look on his face, though, and became a little bit worried, hoping that I hadn't done something wrong or something. "Amanda, I don't mean to scare you, but my paper route is through your neighborhood, and I saw something the other night. While I was heading down your street, I noticed a man coming towards me on the other side of the road. I don't usually see anybody else out there early, so I was a little bit surprised, but as he got closer, I noticed that he had no feet. He made eye contact with me as he said the last part, and I could tell that he was being serious. Look, I had no idea what to do, and I just froze, and he just sort of, floated on past," he said with a dramatic arm wave. He then began to shake his head as if saying no. "Anyways, I think it's a Reaper, and I just thought that you should know, okay?" He made eye contact with me again, but smiled sweetly. I sort of picked my jaw up off the floor and managed to thank him for letting me know, and He nodded dutifully, and we went back into the other room, rejoining the party. I told Madison about it later on in the evening, just as she would want to know what was going on, I guess, with her dad and all, and she seemed embarrassed, but not surprised by this information, and told me to ignore her dad because he was crazy. Her dad carried on as usual around me after that, and never brought it up again with me. After I finished college and moved out, Madison and I sort of lost touch, and I really don't think about her that often, but I do, however, always check to make sure that people have feet when I'm out walking in the early morning hours. I don't know what it was about that story that got to me, but he seemed so genuine. I don't know. What do you guys think? I was at my aunt's house in 2003. Decided to spend the night and hang out with my cousins and all. My aunt lived in a house built around about the 1930s, or thereabouts anyway. And the day was normal. Watching movies, talking nonsense, all that cool teenage stuff that you do when life feels carefree, right? Fast forward to nighttime and everybody goes off to bed. I was just hitting the couch that night and was still up watching TV and texting my girlfriend. The couch that I was sitting on was centered in the living room, so you could walk around it. The living room itself was quite large, with a high ceiling and chandelier in the middle. I remember my girlfriend saying that she was going to brush her teeth before bed, so I started to play games on my phone while waiting for her to text me back. In that time, I must have dozed off, but I woke up with what seemed like minutes later, still holding my phone in front of me. TV was still on, but I could see a faint reflection in the screen of my phone of an old woman standing behind me. I instantly turned to look, but when I did, there was nothing there. I felt uneasy and ended up going to my cousin's room and making up some lie about feeling sick and basically just crashing on the floor. I woke up the following morning and I thought that I must have been overtired or something and let my imagination get the better of me. I was still lying in my makeshift bed while everybody else was still asleep. I needed to use the toilet though, so I got up and walked out of the room. And in the corner of my eye, I saw someone sitting in the armchair in the living room. I immediately turned to look, but this time I saw this lady sitting there in the armchair staring blankly ahead, not noticing me looking. I remember her clear as day as well. Old, 85 to 90 years old I would guess, short white hair and a cream-colored dressing gown with slippers, and the most expressionless stare into just, well, nothing. I went straight into my cousin and woke her. She was irritated and told me to stop playing games with her, but when I went to look again, the lady was gone. About an hour or so passed, and I heard my aunt awake, making coffee. I went and told her what I saw quickly, and she said that she had seen her too. My cousins had not, though, but the fact that my aunt and I had seen her really creeped me out because, well, it sort of validated what I had gone through. Now, this is the part that gets really weird. Fast forward about 5 years, my aunt had moved out and she was living elsewhere, and that house became a distant memory. I was visiting my dad's place on the weekend, and we were talking about paranormal things, and I just so happened to mention my stepmother about the lady that I saw, and her eyes widened immediately. She said that it sounds very familiar to what she had experienced in a house that she lived in growing up. I mentioned the suburb, and she said the street. And yeah, it was the same house. My stepmother, her older brother, and her mother all described what I had seen as well. It was really crazy. But the creepy thing is that my aunt is my mother's sister and doesn't know my stepmother at all. I drove down that street recently, but the house has been knocked down since then. But I always wonder what happened to that lady, who she was, what was she after. She didn't seem evil, I guess, and my aunt said that she could feel someone brushing her gently while she slept in the house from time to time. Maybe she was just lonely. So I have a Labrador, and she has white-yellow fur, so I often see her in the dark, even in extremely low light. Last night at 3, I woke up for a drink, which is pretty rare for me. Usually my dog follows me everywhere, so I kinda didn't notice if she did in the middle of the night, but the room was occupied by me, my sister, who was sleeping on the other side of the room, and Kiki, my dog. When I turned from the kitchen, I saw what I thought was Kiki under my sister's bed, as she usually goes there to sleep anyway. I called for her and could see her eyes moving and staring at me. Dark eyes, a nose on all white fur, with dark background, so pretty visible in low light. I called for her a few times, but she didn't come out, but I could definitely see movement there, like she was moving her head towards me every time that I would call her, and then move it away after a while. After like 15 minutes, I noticed movement on the other side of the room's door from the small gap underneath, and it seemed like Kiki was trying to get my attention from behind the door without barking. She probably understands that everybody is sleeping, so she couldn't bark without it being an emergency. I don't know, but she was trying to get in from that gap. I got really confused though, and immediately opened the door, and found Kiki was in the hallway this whole time. So I went back to see what was under the bed, and now there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. And the window was shut as the AC was on. I don't know what I saw that night, but there was definitely something under my sister's bed. I just hope that there's nothing to worry about, as this is my first experience in this apartment. It's new, but I don't know. I'm in the room right now with Kiki next to me on my bed. Naturally, I've been glancing where I saw it yesterday repeatedly and hoping to not see anything. And I guess my prayers were heard, because this time while cuddling, I heard a whisperish sort of "huh" right next to my ear. I usually always have my AirPods on at this time of night and would be listening to some random stuff, but I haven't been using them since the past 2 days, and now I wonder how many signs I might have missed in the past month that I've lived in this apartment. Anyway, like I said, I'm really not sure what I saw the other night, but whatever it was, I just hope that I don't see it again. When I was about 11 years old, I loved riding my bike. I could do it for hours, in fact. And one day I decided to go to the forest. It was near the village that I lived in, about 1 kilometer away. Around 40 meters away from it, I noticed something. It was something white in the grass on the left side of the road, under a rock. There was a piece of paper with a rock on it, and on the paper was written with charcoal, "Hello." As a dumb kid, I came back the next day. The piece of paper was still there, but when I got there, I also had a piece of paper with the word "Hi" written on it. Then I came back the next day too, and it was written on it, "How are you?" I had the paper and a pencil with me, and I wrote back, "I'm good, you?" Things were going really well. Once I tried staying there the entire day and night to find out who this dude was that was writing those little details. I told my parents that I would stay at a friend's house, but it was to no avail because nobody came. Time passed, and me and whoever this other person was sort of became really good friends. We would have these conversations, and we grew pretty close. One day, not intentionally, we just sort of stopped talking. I just came to the place less and less until eventually I stopped. The last letter that I remember this person writing was, "I'm going to miss you." Now, around 20 years passed, I'm 32, and I found written on paper with charcoal with a rock on top in front of my house, "Missed me," with a question mark. This just happened the other day, and this is my most sincere, what the heck? Nobody knows about this, so there's nobody that could play a prank on me. And I mean, what the heck, right? One day passed, I took the paper inside my house, left it inside my drawer, and to be honest, I'm really not sure what to feel about this. I'm sort of happy, I guess, that whoever this person is came back, but only if this person isn't some evil dude ready to, like, stalk and murder me. I don't think that they are, but what do you guys think? Plus, how did this person find me again? I'm an 18-year-old guy, and for countless years of my childhood, I experienced some, well, let's just say really weird stuff that I still can't understand. It's been on my mind constantly, and I'm not claiming that I saw Casper the Ghost or anything, but, man, let me just tell you everything. What I'm about to share with you guys is my full experiences in as much detail as I can remember them. I've only shared this with my close family. I mean, imagine me telling my friends this. No, it's not a fictional story, and I swear that this is real. So ever since I was a child, I would feel like I was being watched. As a result, I really couldn't sleep alone in my room. I would cry and cry to my parents to let me sleep in their bed. It worked most of the time, but sometimes I was forced to sleep alone. I would always place a large body pillow sort of next to me when I would sleep, so I didn't feel watched as much. My first encounter, though, came when I was probably 7 or 8 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night, which I always did anyway, strangely enough. I took the large body pillow that was next to me and tried to place it on the other side of me, but when I lifted it, there was a woman standing next to my bed, a few meters away. It was really surreal, but I could sort of see through her, but I could still also see details. She was old, she had curly hair, she wore a shirt with buttons all the way down, and there were stripes on her shirt. I could see details all the way down to her waist, where all of a sudden it just sort of cut off. I screamed, ran past her, where my dad came rushing out of their bedroom to see what had happened. After this, I would wake up every single night for the next few years. Maybe it was because I was so alert all the time, but I think it's noteworthy to mention that. Now, I'm not sure about the timeline here, but a little after I got my next incident, an incident that would repeat itself for years on end too. I woke up like I always would around 2 or 3 in the night. This time, a white cloud kind of shaped like a human was standing at my door. It was stationary when all of a sudden it moved a little bit. I would sit there staring at it for like 30 to 60 seconds before it would always disappear into the roof. It would just kind of slowly float up, and after it went away, I would just quietly go to my parents' bed and sleep with them. This would happen at least for a year straight as well. And one time it was a little different though. I was sleeping in my own bed. I was probably 10 plus now, I would guess. I heard a female voice say hi to me. At first, I thought that it was my mother waking me up for school or something, so I'm pretty sure I said something like, "I'll get up soon." But something got me to open up my eyes, and it was standing there at my door, a cloud shaped like a human. I remember saying a few words, but I couldn't say much because of fear. And after a minute, this thing floated up again, and then it was gone. Just a lot of strange stuff would happen too when I was like 10 or 12. Things would sometimes fall down in my room from my shelf at night. So loud, in fact, that my parents would hear it from their bedroom and come in to check on me. I don't remember this one too clearly as well, but one summer night, me and my brother were in the living room when he spotted some weird stuff in the garden. It was a cloud thing, sort of shaped like a human again, going back and forth. But this one was black though, and not white like I would always see. We called my father over and tried to point it out to him, but he couldn't see anything. My brother still brings this up like 7+ years after this event. And at this point, I was so traumatized by this, to be honest, that when I was home alone, I would barricade myself into a room or something like that. One particular incident, though, just tops everything. I was sick at one point, home alone because my mum was at the store. I was playing CSGO in my brother's room, the old Nuke map if anyone knows the game, and a sculpture fell onto my face from above the PC. This wasn't too weird, but I got a little bit scared, so I left the room quickly. When I did, though, across the hallway in front of my room, I saw the cloud-shaped like person again, but it was going extremely fast towards the kitchen this time. I had never seen it move like this. In fact, I'd never really seen it in the day like this. So I slammed the door and jumped out the window, where I just waited for my parents. What I've noted is that all the activity of this thing would happen in front of my door. Our house is built pretty strange, it's sort of hard to explain, but my door is visible from almost everywhere in the house. In recent years, my oldest brother, who was very skeptical of my stories and would tease me, started talking about some weird experiences that he had too. He said that it was common for him to hear very heavy footsteps outside the bathroom when he was brushing his teeth at night. It was so heavy that he would feel the vibration in the floor, in fact. When he would check, nothing was ever there, and it just stopped, then started again a few minutes after. The bathroom is located just outside of my room, exactly where I would see this thing a lot. In the beginning of all of this, my parents thought that I was lying just to be sleeping in their room. But when I woke up every single morning to eat breakfast with them, and I would be telling them what I saw last night, they started believing me more and more, I guess. Now, my grandmother died a few years before I was born. She would always talk about how excited she was to meet her grandkids. When I described the woman in my room, I was describing a large part of my grandmother, apparently. Curly hair, shirt with buttons and stripes on her shirt. Keep in mind, I'd never seen a picture of her when I was that age, so I had no idea what she looked like. But at this point, I was practically begging my parents to get some help. They eventually contacted a guy that claimed to be able to get this thing away. My parents weren't buying it 100%, but they did it for me. I was told that I was too young to participate in whatever they were going to do, so I couldn't be there. I was told that he claimed that an entity was living in the kitchen, my room, and the living room. And apparently they sat in a circle and did some ritual before being charged $60. But, amazingly enough, after it all changed for me. I never felt watched again, I never saw anything again, and I could actually sleep in my own bed at night. I really don't know how to feel about this. I know what I saw countless times, but I just can't shrug it off. It's hard to live with for me, and I have a lot of questions about what all of that was. But anyway, it's all over now. Well, it seems to be, and I just hope that whatever this thing was, it doesn't come back. When I was a kid in the 90s, I would often sleep at my grandmother's house in the middle of a small village in the Jura region of France. The bedroom that I would stay in was called the room in the back. As the name suggests, it was one of the last two rooms at the end of a main corridor shaped like an L. There wasn't really anything special about that bedroom. It was pretty small and contained a bed, shelves with books, and some other basic furniture. Yet, for some reason, that room just always creeped me out. I felt an unwelcoming presence, and I would always struggle to fall asleep, scared of whatever invisible forces seemed to be lurking in the dark there. One night there, though, when I was around 8 years old, I woke up scared and confused, because I found myself lying down on the floor and in total darkness. I feel I need to make two things clear here, though. This is the only time in my entire life that I have ever awakened outside of whatever bed or couch that I had been sleeping in. The second thing to note is that, despite the fact that the house is located in a small village, it wasn't particularly isolated, and the streetlights outside, they would always let a bit of light filter through the closed blinds at night. So, here I was, a child surrounded by total obscurity, struggling to understand why I wasn't in my bed. I tried my best to stay calm and touched around me, hoping to find the side of the bed nearby at least, so that I could climb back in. But I simply just couldn't find it. I tried for several minutes too, but it just didn't seem to be there. which was extremely strange considering that the bedroom wasn't that big in the first place. I sort of therefore decided to move forward in a single direction to find a wall that I could then follow until I would find the bed. But things got even stranger as I tried to find a wall. I would bump into furniture that I would not recognize, and despite all my efforts, I simply just couldn't find one. Everything around me was completely and utterly unfamiliar. I thought about calling for help. My grandmother was sleeping in the bedroom on the other side of the corridor, and my parents in the living room. However, I imagined them finding me screaming on the floor, and in the end I decided not to, not wanting to face that kind of embarrassment. Finally, I fell asleep on the floor, giving up on finding the bed. And I woke up the next morning in that bed and under the blankets. It was like the entire event had been nothing more than a really weird dream, yet it just didn't feel like a dream. I am a natural lucid dreamer, and even back then I was already very familiar with how dreams feel, and it just wasn't one, or at least I don't think it was. Anyway, a few years ago, a long time after this strange occurrence, I went to England to visit my aunt, who's from the other side of my family. She claims to be a witch and is into a lot of New Age stuff. I've always been skeptical, but I have to admit that she's done and said a few strange things that got me to go from not believing her at all to being a bit more neutral about it, I guess. So we were talking about our respective families, and she went on about the only time when she had ever been in my grandmother's house when I was a baby. I thought that it was a good opportunity to see if she had sensed anything unusual there, and asked her, making sure to keep the question open enough to not influence her. And the first thing she said was, yes, the room in the back." She said it in English and had no idea that we called it that way in French. "There's something wrong in that room," she said. I was spooked. Once I got back to France, I decided to confront my mother about it, since she'd spent her childhood in that house, and as soon as I asked her what the heck was wrong with that room in the back, she froze and her face became white. She explained to me that when she was little, she went in that bedroom with a few friends and they tried to invoke spirits for fun one time. They sat down on the floor in a circle, holding hands, and said, "Spirit, if you're there, knock 3 times. And apparently they immediately heard 3 very violent knocks and ran off screaming. She told me that ever since then, the room has always felt weird. And that's it. Nowadays, the room is pretty different, but still used as a guest room. It still feels weird, but I'd say a lot less than when I was a kid. I know my brothers who are 10 years younger have also complained about feeling uncomfortable there for some reason, but they never had any unusual experiences there. Well, none like mine, anyway." I haven't really told a lot of people about this story, but it's still one of the scariest things that I've ever experienced. Maybe someone here can shed some light on what you think this was. So, in 2018 to 2019, I was dating this guy, and I would always sleep over at his place on the weekends. I would sleep on the right side of the bed, and he would sleep on the left side. And one night, I woke up because I guess I could feel something staring at me. I opened my eyes, and my boyfriend was sitting on the edge of the bed, to my right, just sort of staring at me and smiling, but the way he looked was so creepy. Nothing different about how he looked, but the only way that I can explain it is sort of, well, evil. Like super big smile and really wide eyes, just sort of staring at me, but not saying anything. Now, this guy would always mess with me and joke around, so I thought that he was just trying to freak me out or something. I was about to ask him what he was doing too, like the words were about to come out, when all of a sudden I felt his body laying down, asleep, heard him breathing deep to the left of me. I immediately knew that whatever this thing was that was staring at me was not my boyfriend. I stopped myself from saying anything or even looking at my actual boyfriend lying next to me. I was still looking right at whatever this thing was that I had thought was my boyfriend, and I had an overwhelming sense of just feeling like I was in danger, and if I said anything or looked at my boyfriend to my left, that it would know that I knew that it wasn't my boyfriend and something bad was about to happen. All of this was going through my mind super fast, like it was maybe 3 seconds after I realized that my boyfriend was actually asleep to my left, that I just quickly grabbed the comforter, closing my eyes, and threw it over my head while turning, grabbing hold of my real boyfriend, and I just stayed like that until I fell back asleep eventually from exhaustion. Now, I've had sleep paralysis before, a couple of times in fact, and I know how it feels. And this was definitely not sleep paralysis. I still remember every detail so vividly, and to this day, I have no idea what that was. For some background, I'm a male in my late 20s living in northern Canada, and last weekend I got a call from a friend telling me that while on his ski-doo trip, he went on by my cabin as it was on his route, and that it looked like someone broke into it and smashed all of the windows. Devastated, I went out to my shed to load up my ski and sled with boards and tarps to repair the windows, hopeful to keep some of the snow out of my cabin until I could probably replace the windows in the spring. And just as I was about to leave, I got this, I don't know, gut feeling that something was wrong and that I should take a rifle just in case, because better to be safe than sorry. As I started my ride into the woods, I noticed the sky getting darker and I thought to myself, great, now I'll have a storm to deal with too. Luckily it wasn't a snowstorm, but just a thick fog that rolled in quickly. There's nothing more unsettling too than being alone in the woods like that, encased in a thick fog, especially with God knows what around you. But I finally get to my cabin and sure enough all of my windows are smashed. I unload my gear and get to work, trying to get my cabin secure as fast as I can and get the heck out of there. At some point though, I feel like all of a sudden I'm being watched, which gives me a bit of a lump in my throat because I can't see anything in this fog. Then I hear something moving through the trees. I automatically grab my rifle and put my back to the cabin, hoping that if something comes out of the fog that I'll be ready for it. My first thought was that it was the terrible person who broke into my cabin, coming back under the cover of the fog to see what else they could take. But then I realized that no Ski-Doo approached me, as I would have heard one from miles away as it was so quiet out there. After waiting a while with no more noises coming from the woods, I go back to work, get my windows fixed, and I return back to my Ski-Doo to get the heck out of there. After a short ride, I notice something that looks like pot poles in the middle of the trail, and it turns out to be polar bear tracks leading towards my cabin. That creepy feeling of being watched and the noises from the woods was probably a polar bear stalking me, and was the actual culprit of the break-in at my cabin. What disturbs me most is that, honestly, I would never have seen it coming with all that fog that day. And my rifle, well, it would have been practically useless against such a huge animal like that. To this day, I genuinely feel lucky to be alive. I really love to drive for DoorDash on my free time. Something about getting out past midnight and just driving is very soothing to me. And why not make some money doing it too, right? Well, my wife hates it though. Specifically me going out past midnight in what she calls the bad sides of town. I don't see it like that though. I've driven for DoorDash for a bit now, and I've never once felt a fear for my own safety, much less a fear for my life, and I love driving on the west side, south side, and downtown around midnight. But let me run through my shift tonight. So, I started my dash in at around 5 PM to hit the dinner rush, and it was slow, so I did a lot of waiting for a while. 6 p.m. I started feeling oddly restless, in a way that I haven't felt before. I felt like I needed to get out of my car and run a mile or something, like I just couldn't keep my legs still. I parked at a gas station to walk around and get a soda and a water to calm my nerves, and it worked for a bit. 7 p.m. I drove to the west side. I felt great and was doing really well with how much I was making. No changes in how I did things at all, too. It was just a very average hour, to be honest. The only thing that I did notice was that I was making tons of stupid mistakes. I was missing turns, driving too slow, even stopped at a green light as if it was a stop sign. At 8 p.m. I started working the south side, and this is when things got, weird for a lack of a better term. I left the west side with the sun still showing, but by the time that I made it, the sun was completely gone. This was odd too, considering that I've never noticed it get so dark so quickly before. What I mean is that I drive this almost every day, but this was different. It didn't just get dark in a sort of normal way. It got dark normally, but this time I was hyper aware of it, I guess. It's hard to explain, but I just noticed it so much more than before. This is when my anxiety started creeping back. My legs got restless again. I started feeling like I needed to get out of my car and run a mile again. But I brushed it off and continued my work. Although I remained hyper-aware of the darkness, and during one order when I was picking up food I could feel it, the darkness was heavy and deep, almost like a low frequency that I just couldn't hear or something, but was sort of vibrating throughout my body. I could feel the heaviness of my heart causing strain on my chest, though, and I thought that I could hear it drumming in my ears as well at one point. At 9 p.m. I accepted an order that took me to the western area of the south side, an area and neighborhood that I've been in hundreds of times before. I stopped my car at the house, and something just hit me like a ton of bricks. All of a sudden, I felt really scared, but not like average fear. There was this absolute sense of complete and total dread that just overtook me. In an instant, I felt like I was being stared at too, and I know it's such a cliche thing to say, but I'm being completely serious when I say that I would have bet all my money that there was someone in the backseat of my car staring at me all of a sudden. I could feel the heaviness almost, just like earlier in the night tonight, sitting in my car in front of this home. I started to tear up a bit, as I felt closer to death than I ever have before. I worked up the bravery to turn around, but of course when I did, nothing was in the back seat, besides the darkness that felt really heavy, as if it was made of solid matter. I just cannot explain, though, how physical the darkness of my back seat felt. Like I was staring at a person sitting in the back seat, like their weight was being put onto the car, but nobody was there. I got out of my car to try and shake it off, and when I did, I saw another car pull up in the driveway of the home. I thought that maybe I could hand it to them and get on my way, but they just sort of sat in their car looking at me, and looking down at the shining light that I could see was their phone. They did this 3 times before I worked up the bravery, and I walked the order to the door, every step further increasing my sense of absolute horror for some reason. But I dropped it off, took the picture, and rushed to my car. I turned to my left, seeing the person still sitting in their car in the driveway, their face illuminated by their phone, but they were just sort of staring at me. I locked my doors and I looked in the back seat again. Still nobody there, and it was confirmed due to the light being on from the opening door. But because I locked the door, the light slowly dimmed to darkness again. And the feeling this time was heavier than even before. As soon as the darkness of my back seat hit, it was like the car was full of people sitting back there, just staring intensely back at me. I couldn't look away from the darkness. I felt like I was being crushed by the fear and the anxiety. I turned my car around quickly and I drove off, noticing how the person in the car in the driveway was now no longer in the car, which didn't make any sense because how the heck did they get out of the car so quickly? 9:30 hit and I closed out my shift at this point. I was sobbing in the driver's seat with my inside car lights on as I drove home. My mind was spinning. I was lightheaded, the sense of absolute total horror was gone, and in its place was just a void, emptiness, as if something occupied my soul for just a moment and then left it wide open and vacant. I walked into my home. My wife greeted me, noting how I returned early. I fell into her arms and sobbed again. It's now 11 p.m. and I'm sitting on my couch with all the lights on, and I just feel utterly alone, empty, completely void of all emotion besides one feeling, a slight semblance of fear sitting in that empty void. My wife wanted me to take out the trash to the dumpster outside, but I just couldn't do it. I don't know why, but I just can't go back outside in the dark tonight. I know that this whole thing is really weird to say the least, but if any of you guys know anything about what might have happened tonight, please do tell me, because that fear, it's still sitting with me. Around 2014, in a summer in a small provincial town in Ecuador, I was working in my father's farm. He was dedicated to livestock, so every weekend after school, he'd help with daily tasks, such as feeding the cows, and go over to them to make sure that they're not missing or have any problems and stuff. Well, one Saturday I did a routine afternoon batch check around 3 p.m. For some reason I couldn't do it earlier, so I rode my horse called Loco and went to see them in the afternoon. It was a bit of a trip, but it was about 50 minutes to an hour because there was a shortage of pasture on the farm and we had to rent a piece of land nearby. The outward journey and the batch check passed without incident. It was around 5:30 in the afternoon, so I started the journey back, and 30 minutes back home I just felt a strange, I don't know, like wind on my body or something. I was skeptical until that moment, but for some weird reason that feeling made me think something bad was about to happen. Almost instantly too, I noticed that Loco began to struggle with the reins. Something strange, since he was a noble and really calm horse. However, he began to move his ears abruptly, his hair curled, and his body struggled against the side of the road, as if to say, I want to dodge something and run. And with all my strength, I tried to control him with the reins while that was happening, and my head involuntarily turned to the right, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a black silhouette, maybe 1.5 meters away from us, disappear from the fence that surrounded us and made its way through the undergrowth. The undergrowth began trembling, and it was breaking everything when it disappeared. It didn't run, it didn't fly, it simply just sort of vanished. I really don't think it was an animal too, since it didn't make any animal noises or the typical sound when an animal or a person flees. Whatever this thing was, it seemed almost supernatural or something. What I mean is that it just sort of vanished in a huge rumble of dry undergrowth. While that happened too, in a brief second my hands went completely numb from the force that I applied on the wheels, and Loco simply started running, and I, still confused, held on with the little strength that I had left so as not to fall and injure myself. After minutes of intense running, Loco finally stopped his gallop. I went down to drink some water in a stream, and it was at this time that I noticed that my eyes began to burn like nothing else. They just burned like having bathed in pepper spray or something, and I hadn't done or touched anything to make this happen. When I got home and unsaddled my horse, I went inside, and my mother asked me almost immediately what had happened to my eyes. I simply replied that it was my sweat, that it wasn't necessary for her to be alarmed that way, but she insisted that I go look in the mirror, and when I did, I noticed that my eyes were full of blood, almost like crying blood too. There was not a single white space in my eyes any longer. There was nothing but 2 meatballs filled with red as vivid as blood. That obviously scared me, and I couldn't help but feel that it was somehow related to that black thing that I saw. It should be noted that my doctor couldn't find a medical or even a logical explanation about what had happened to my eyes, and that no medication helped. In fact, my eyes remained that way pretty much for 2 months. Telling this to my mum and brother, they just froze. My brother went the next day to check the area where I had seen that sighting, to have a look around and see if he could find anything. And he told me that there were no trails, roads, or at least one broken branch. Everything was completely clean. It was just really weird, and there were no plants there that would cause this. He acquired some water samples for the doctor, and they came back negative too. It's been 8 years, and I remember it vividly, and I haven't been back to that place since then. Loco unfortunately died a year ago, and it's sad to know that he was my partner and the only one who ever experienced that with me. I miss you, Loco. I go hunting in southern Illinois on property that my family owns. The place is practically my second home, and I've spent countless hours exploring all around every inch of it. Caught all the fish in the area, I've hunted every legal game and spotted the rest. So when I say that I've never had an experience like this, remember that this was my domain that I felt comfortable in any weather, at any time, with any equipment, or even lack thereof. So 2 deer seasons ago, I'd pulled into the farm at probably about 4:40 in the morning. It was November, so at least 2 hours till sunlight. I pull my stuff out of the truck and I walk into the woods. I have my shotgun and a revolver, knife on my belt, an elbow light clipped to the front of me, a thermos of coffee, and a backpack with a book and a couple of other things for cleaning my deer should I get lucky. So, I walk off the drive and into the woods. The tree stand that I'm going to is less than a mile away, but through some dense second-growth forest and down a rather steep hill, across some bottoms, then a lung-burning steep climb up another ridge. I always dread the hike, but it's a good spot, so I often do it. I make it down to the bottoms, slush through the icy muck, and get to the climbing. With my flashlight clipped to my chest, I keep needing to physically turn my body to throw the beam around, and see trees that I recognize to determine my path. This, of course, always gives the forest a horror movie vibe, even on the best of days. The leaves and the underbrush are encased in frost, so every one of my steps comes with a solid crunch, no matter how quiet I'm trying to be. This time, though, I noticed that there was more noise than usual. What I mean is that something else was crunching close by, too. I walked about maybe a quarter of the way up the hill listening to my company the whole time, seeming to stay the same distance away as I moved. Naturally, I think to myself that I'm going to have a quick hunting day, so I plop my butt down next to a tree. I can't shoot until first light, but I'm hoping if I stay really still that whatever I'm hearing will lounge around until then. So I click off my light, unsling the shotgun, and I lay it over my knees to wait. Except I don't really hear anything now. Whatever it was, it must have been spooked by my flashlight spinning all around as I sat. I still stayed a bit, sipping some coffee to make sure, but I gave up after 15 minutes or so of dead silence from the forest floor. And I probably didn't even make it 4 steps before the moving starts again. At this point, I'm still not freaked out. I stay facing the way that I am, and I flip the light off again and sidestep behind a tree. And sure enough, I don't hear anything again. 2 minutes of sitting there frustrated before I start moving again, and my new friend does too. And this is where I started to get a bit nervous, because I worked my way up the hill, stopping to turn and look every so often, and when I stopped, the sound would go on for just an infinitesimally longer amount of time than my own steps. Like something seeing me stop and doing its very best to stop before I heard it. This happened no less than 4 times as well, and by now, I'm sweating bullets and freezing cold because, well, it's the middle of winter. I abandoned my thermos near a tree so that I could hold my flashlight and my revolver at the same time, and the last 100 feet or so to my stand was done backwards so that I could be facing the noise and, in theory, keep it from moving. And I didn't hear anything again after that. I got up into my stand and I smoked like 5 cigarettes in a row, It gave me a sense of security being up in a tree behind camouflage like that. Still, I only hunted for like an hour of daylight and went back early that day, and I wasn't moving slow headed back to the truck, even with the sun shining bright at this point. Now, I haven't told my family about this because, well, I don't think that they would believe me, but man, when I think back about it, it was freaky. The sound, and when it decided to happen, felt, well, very human, which it likely was, as poachers and trespassers occasionally wander onto our property. Still, ever since then, when I go hunting, I'm much better about letting people know where I am going and for how long these days. I still don't know what that was. I didn't see anything, which is perhaps the most strange part. I thought that I would have seen something at least, being that the sound sounded so close. In the end, I still have no idea what happened that day, and if you guys know anything about what it could have been, then I would love to hear it. Growing up in the 90s, I was always exposed to a fair amount of aliens in the media. Movies and TV like Independence Day, MIB, Mars Attacks, E.T., X-Files, Invader Zim, Alf, Third Rock from the Sun. I can't remember anyone in my family ever taking any sort of particular interest in aliens, but they were just always sort of, I don't know, around. I don't know if this media is why, or maybe it was my parents' open attitude towards the subject, but I never questioned the existence of them. I knew stories about people being abducted in crop circles, but I didn't feel like it presented any sort of immediate danger. I never considered myself to be afraid of them, and that is until my mum started asking me about it one morning. I've always been a sleep talker. Well, more of a sleep mumbler, I guess, but when I was 9 or 10, I started sleepwalking as well. My parents would find me in like the living room or the hallway trying to incoherently accomplish something. Most of the time, they could just guide me back to my bed without incident. But on one occasion, it just wasn't that simple. When my mum came to check on me before she went to sleep, she saw that I wasn't in my bed. She came into the room to look for me and noticed a small figure crouched in the closet. She asked me what I was doing and came closer to help me back to bed. And as she started to approach, I guess that I started crying and mumbling about aliens, and I even peed on the floor. She was shocked and called for my dad to come and help her. When he arrived, he tried to pick me up to comfort me, but I started screaming and I hit him in the face apparently, something that I'd never done before and haven't done again since then. They had to let me cry myself out, mumbling the aliens and don't take me again over and over until I would let them help me. My mum says that she doesn't think that I ever really woke up too, because I didn't say anything as she changed my pajamas and tucked me back in. The next morning when she asked me if I had had a dream about aliens, I didn't know what she was talking about. I mean, I had no recollection of anything that had happened the night before. She asked if being abducted by aliens was something that I worried about often, and I honestly told her that it just wasn't. My parents never made a big deal about the occurrence. They just wanted to make sure that I was all right, but I was pretty embarrassed by it. Since I had no memory of the event, I wasn't left with any fear of the aliens while I was awake, but I was left with a burning curiosity, I guess, as to whether they would be back. I used to frequent a relatively popular 11.5-mile hiking trail. The lot that this trail is on is only about 50 or so acres, so the trail winds back and forth in order to fit. So one day I was hiking. This particular day was very nice, the weather was good, and I hadn't seen a lot of people. At one point, about maybe 10 feet off the trail, I could see where I was going parallel to the same trail as it turned on and sort of snaked back about a mile ahead. I hope that makes sense, but I noticed that by that section of the trail, there was a fallen tree with 3 people sitting on it. A man, a woman, and a boy. But this by itself wouldn't have been unusual, as it is one of the most popular trails in this area. The problem was, though, is that they were sitting, like, completely still and completely silent. Their backs were to me, and they seemed to be staring straight ahead, almost as if they were sort of, I don't know, entranced or something. I was very unsettled, as this is obviously unusual behavior, so I kept walking, but being as unsettled as I was, I sort of looked back and was startled to find that they were gone. I stopped in my tracks, listening, but hearing nothing. I'll tell you why this startled me too, because any outdoorsman will tell you that sound travels in the woods. Sound becomes entrapped by the canopy and funneled through the trees. If somebody steps 100 feet away, you're likely to hear it, and I, having been raised in the woods, have ears attuned to such sounds. Yet those three people were able to move without me hearing, well, a thing. In the end, I just sort of dismissed it. Maybe my mind was preoccupied and I just hadn't heard them. So I turned back around to keep walking, and ahead of me now, on my section of the trail, there they were, with their backs to me again. I saw them silently walk away over a hill, and after that, I never saw them again. So now, not only had I failed to hear them, but I'd failed to see them walk past me, and I really don't know how. I immediately called my friend up, told him that the children of the corn were out at Swayback, and kept him on the phone so that he could send help if he heard me get hit by a pitchfork or something. There's a possibility, I admit, that I'm remembering details inaccurately, and what happened in reality might have been, I don't know, much less uncanny, but this experience, it still bugs me to this day, and I'm almost certain that it happened the way I tell it. This all started when I was 14, when my mum met her new boyfriend. His name was Ray. I remember the first time that he met me and my siblings. He looked at my mum and said, "Oh wow, didn't know you had a gang," which, looking back on it, was a very weird thing for him to say, since he had been on a few dates with my mum before and she had told him exactly how many kids she had. Honestly though, Ray seemed like a normal guy at first. He was in his 40s and had 2 older sons from his last marriage, who would sometimes come over for dinner, but things went wrong after he moved in. He would yell a lot and have a loud argument with my mum almost every day and throw things at her, but he would always sweet-talk his way around her afterwards, and this is probably why she didn't leave him sooner. My mum was crazy young when she had us, and she has always been a bit immature for her age, so I think that it made it easier for him. But Ray found it difficult to get along with my siblings and me. He would complain about every little thing that we did wrong and quickly became very controlling. But whenever we complained about how he was acting to our mum, he would accuse us of trying to ruin their relationship. This would work pretty much every time too, since it would cause her to get angry and yell at us instead of him. As we got older, he stopped us from seeing friends that he didn't like and wouldn't allow any friends to come over unless they had his approval first. I realized that he was crazy when he picked me up from school one day, which he never did, and while driving home, he accused my sister and me of trash-talking him behind his back. When I asked him how he would even know that, he told me that he had proof. When we got home, he showed me a tape recorder and played back a recording of my sister and me complaining about him in our bedroom at night. I asked him why the heck he put recorders in our bedroom for, and we had a huge argument over this. But I immediately called my mum and told her. I later found out from her that she never actually said anything about it to him. I made him remove all the tape recorders from our bedroom, but I'm convinced that he kept on hiding them, since he would sometimes bring up conversations that my sister and I had while he wasn't around. We were so paranoid that we would whisper, and we would never talk about anything private in case he somehow heard it. We were so terrified that he also had cameras as well as tape recorders, and we would dress and undress super quickly so if there were any cameras that he wouldn't be able to see anything. And it really makes me angry thinking about the fear that we lived in while living there. When I was 16, I got a job at a fast food place, and Ray had a big problem with that as well. His reasoning for this was that my boyfriend at the time worked there, and he believed that I was just going there to mess around with my boyfriend. So his way of checking on me was to come and sit in the parking lot and record me. He did this too for a complete month. He would show me the recordings after which, and would just lead to even more arguments, ending with 16-year-old me begging a 40-plus man to not stalk me at work. I was pretty much done at this point and moved in with my dad, who had just moved back from New Zealand. My dad was so angry when I told him about everything that had happened, and he wanted to call the cops on Ray, but my mum begged him not to. They broke up a few years later after something unrelated, but thankfully, I never saw him again after this. I was 14 at the time of this incident. I was home with my brother, grandma, and my baby cousin. My brother had invited some girl over. Please remember that part too, because it is key to this story. My brother then introduced us to the girl. She looked normal, but seemed a bit, I don't know, maybe nervous or something. My grandma asked her some questions and told her that if her and my brother needed anything, to let her know. Anyways, my grandma told me to stay upstairs and allow my brother and the girl privacy downstairs. Of course, me being the nosy little sister, I wanted to know everything, especially this new girl that my brother brought home. I sort of snuck down the hall quietly and looked over the banister. I saw the girl looking outside the backyard and also asking my brother questions like, "Who all live here? Is this your guys' house? It's so nice." Hearing the conversation, I decided to listen to my grandma and go back inside my room. I began to listen to music and felt the urge to look outside my window. I then saw a 2000 Chevrolet Impala parked outside of our driveway. The door was wide open, and it appeared to be a man leaving our home with all of our tech items from our home and packing it inside the car. A feeling of dread came over me, like, yo, what is going on? Then the sound of loud talking was heard downstairs, and my brother said, "Please, you don't have to do this. Just let us leave if you know what's best for you," the girl responded. I hurried and ran to my grandma as quietly as I could to let her know what I saw downstairs and what I heard. She didn't understand the severity of what I was telling her and began to laugh, which kind of made me upset because, our life could have been in danger, right? I heard tires screech and saw the Chevrolet Impala speed down the street. I called out to my brother and he said, in a really distraught voice, "What's going on and who was that man outside?" I asked. He didn't reply. I walked downstairs and saw my brother shaking his head in disbelief, looking at where our TV used to be. The police came shortly due to my grandma calling them. We were later informed that my brother and the girl met for the first time that day, off of a dating app of all things. And of course, they met at our home. The girl, of course, set up the entire robbery. She was just the decoy until her boyfriend came to rob us. But this next part that I'm about to share always makes my blood run cold. You see, the guy who robbed us held my brother at knife point and said that if he didn't comply that he would stab all of us upstairs as a punishment for him getting in the way. The cops asked my brother to give him a description, but he didn't. Later on the same day, we then heard a truck park on the side of the house. Whoever was in it, they yelled, threw a glass bottle down and drove off. I'm not sure if it was the same man who robbed us, but it terrified me nevertheless. I'm really grateful that nothing happened to my brother or my family, but I guess it just goes to show that you really just cannot trust anyone in this world.